What in the hell are those? Clarence had gone to Reggie's Veggies to buy seeds, just as he had every year since Reggie had opened. David Decker probably bought his seeds here too, Clarence reflected. It was part of the reason that Clarence kept coming back. The fact that Reggie was a friend since boyhood, and Clarence taking his business to a new feed store up the road would hurt his feelings, was secondary. Clarence wanted to beat David, wanted to beat him so bad he could taste it. David was a bit of a local celebrity, a legend in the agricultural community, and he'd grown the biggest pumpkins in the county for the last 5 years running. For the last 5 years, Clarence had been content with second place, but he felt that this year was different somehow. This was the year that he beat David Decker and took his rightful place as the biggest pumpkin grower in the county. This year was also different because Reggie said he had something special for Clarence. He had what he called a secret weapon, and he assured him that it would finally wipe the smile off old Decker's face. Reggie had no reason to dislike Decker. He was probably one of Reggie's best customers after all. But the old man had been getting cocky lately, and his bravado had turned the humble produce seller's stomach. Clarence picked up the packet and looked at it. It was just a normal pack of seeds, maybe a little old and crumpled, but clearly just seeds. Reggie had found them in a trunk that had belonged to his grandfather, and they had looked eldritch on the semi-modern countertop. The paper had taken on that soft, velvety feel of a material that has seen the fall of the Second World War, and the seeds inside felt like hard little bullets under Clarence's thumb. The paper declared them to be Blutkürbisser, and everything on the package was in a foreign language. He would have sworn it was something that Reggie had bought from a joke shop, if he wasn't so serious. To be sure, Reggie was a practical joker, but his face was stone-cold serious as he looked at him from across the counter of his vegetable stand. "Blood pumpkins," Clarence said skeptically. "Blood pumpkins," Reggie intoned, back with deep seriousness. "I don't know, Reggie. These things look older than God. You sure they'll grow?" "Absolutely," Reggie stretched the word into 3. "Granddad bought 'em back when he was in Germany. He said the pumpkins he saw over there were huge." Clarence scoffed. "Your granddad was a sodbuster, just like mine, Reggie. When did he go to Germany?" "During the war, same as your granddad, except your granddad spent it in Alaska." Clarence wanted to take offense to that, but Reggie was right. Granddad had gotten a very cushy post, while Reggie's granddad had gotten half his leg blown off by a potato masher and was sent home with honors. Reggie's granddad had used the payout from the government to buy the building where the feed store now sat, while Clarence's grandfather had used his payout to buy the land where his farm was. Just because Reggie Sr. had been a drunk who had squandered the family business was no fault of his. "Let me get my usual spread of regular pumpkins too, Reggie, just to be safe. So, how do these work anyway? Any special instructions for these German pumpkins?" Granddad always said that the man who gave him the seeds said that a sacrifice was required to see them reach their full potential. What that sacrifice was, the man wouldn't say. Granddad figured if anyone knew anything about sacrifices, it'd be farmers, like you and me. Reggie wasn't wrong. All farming was one sacrifice after another. Farmers sacrificed their time, their love, their family, their hair, and damn near everything else so they could afford to keep the taxes paid and the lights on year after year. Sod bustin' was nothing but sacrifice in many ways, and Clarence figured he'd plant the seeds and see what came of them. He honestly figured he'd get more out of the other packs of seeds than these old pumpkin bullets anyway. He would look back on that moment and reflect that he had known nothing of sacrifice. The seeds went into the ground in the east field, just like generations of pumpkins had before them. As he stood up and rubbed the dirt from his hands, he looked across the field he had nurtured and felt the same sense of pride he always did. Corn was coming up, potatoes and yams, beans and peanuts. The fruit trees were filling the orchard with their sweet scent, and now the pumpkins would be the crowning jewel of his farm. The July sun beat down on him, and he shaded his eyes as he surveyed his kingdom. Clarence knew it wouldn't be long before harvest time. Soon the fields would be filled with the sounds of picking and packing, and it would be time to take another load down to Reggie's so he could sell his wares. Clarence could lay enough back to make it through the winter, and maybe even a little more for the inevitable repairs to the barn or the house, maybe for some expansion next year when the taxes came in. And, he reflected, once he won this year's grand prize for biggest pumpkin, Clarence could open up his own stall the following spring and sell his own wares, just like his father used to. It was a great plan, and now it was time to see if it could bear fruit. Pumpkins grew pretty quickly, as pumpkins do, but after a month, Clarence had 3 that he believed would be real contenders. He had named them, as he did every year, and the names he had chosen were no less grand than the pumpkins themselves. Hercules, Goliath, and Samson dwarfed their fellows by quite a bit, and it seemed that they would be the entries this year. Some people thought it was silly to name a pumpkin, but Clarence always named the ones he thought would be entries in the fair. The other 40 or so would be sold to pie makers, pumpkin carvers, and all sorts of other folks, but these 3 would be weighed, judged, and then made into pies by Mrs. Clarence for the pie contest to be held 2 days hence. He always laughed about it, but Clarence always felt a little sorry to see her make those pumpkins into pies after he'd worked so hard raising them. On the other hand, the blood pumpkin had sprouted only a single offering. Clarence had named him Fritz and set him apart from the rest. So far, it was underperforming, and Clarence didn't think it would amount to much. Fritz wasn't even as big as most of his regular pumpkins, but he kept tending it in hopes that maybe Fritz was just a late bloomer. He'd been surprised when he'd gotten a pumpkin at all from the seeds, and Clarence had held out hope that maybe Reggie's granddad was right about those pumpkins that would be bigger than the regular ones. He pruned it and weeded it by hand, just as he did with the other 3, in the hopes that maybe it would grow bigger and he could sell it as an oddity at Reggie's stand. While his other pumpkins were orange, this one was a deeper orange, like a blood orange, and its leaves had a strange, wilted look to them. Clarence was certain that it would make someone an extra creepy jack-o'-lantern when Halloween rolled around, but he really didn't have high hopes for the stunted little thing other than that. Then, one morning, after caring for it for the past 4 weeks, Clarence was in for a surprise. A painful surprise. Clarence was out tending to the pumpkins, tracking their growth as he nurtured them. His top 3 were still larger and fuller than the others, and Goliath was quickly showing himself to be the front-runner for this year's contest winner. He was pruning around Fritz, his mind wandering, when the shears caught the edge of his index finger. It wasn't a deep cut, but like any wound, it bled a little bit. Clarence snatched his finger back and put it in his mouth, but not before a few drops of blood splattered on the earth around the pumpkin. He didn't think much of it at the time. It was just a cut, and he slid the bandana out of his pocket and held it to the wound. He waited for the bleeding to stop and then got back to work. He didn't think anything about it until the next day. When he went to go check on the pumpkins, Clarence noticed something odd had happened. It wasn't substantial. The pumpkin hadn't grown giant overnight, but the blood pumpkin had grown. The day before, it had been no bigger than a craft store decoration, but now it bulged from the ground like a blood-red tumor. Overnight, it had become larger than Samson, the smallest of his entries for the fair. Clarence scratched his head as he took in the anomaly, getting knee-bound so he could take a better look at Fritz. He had done nothing different besides giving it his blood. Then he remembered what Reggie had said. The plant required a sacrifice. The pumpkin needed something more than water and sunlight to thrive, and Clarence suddenly wondered how big Fritz could get. Wasn't the notion of beating Decker worth a little blood? As though in a daze, Clarence pulled out his buck knife and slid the blade across the meat of his palm. The sting was little more than an afterthought, and as he squeezed his fingers together, he watched a scarlet stream fall onto the soil beneath the pumpkin. The drops splashed onto the vines as well, a single fat drop splattering the body of the gourd, and as it fell, Clarence could swear he heard it growing. It was a soft, whispery sound, like the trees in a light wind, and as the ground drank his blood, it left nothing behind. It grew before his eyes, looking bigger than it had a minute ago. Clarence wrapped the same bandana around his hand and got back to work. The pumpkins required a lot of TLC, but it would all be worth it once he wiped the smile off of David Decker's face. When he returned the next day, Fritz had grown 3 inches overnight. For the next 2 weeks, Clarence made a splash of his blood a regular part of the pumpkin's diet. It was never much, the amount you'd get from a diabetes test, but in 2 weeks, he noticed a change in the size of the blood pumpkin. It grew as big as any of the pumpkins Clarence had planned to enter, overshadowing Goliath by a large margin. By the last week of August, Fritz was the clear entry for the fair this year. The sight of Fritz filled Clarence with pride, but it also made his finger itch. Anyone who cared to look would have seen the bruises on his fingertips and palms. Mrs. Clarence had certainly made a lot of them as she doctored them at the dining room table, but she was the only one so far. The farm had a lot of visitors in the last week of August, to his surprise, and it seemed that someone had seen his blood pumpkin. It was his neighbor first. He could hardly miss a pumpkin that was nearly 5 feet tall and 4 feet wide. He wondered if he could come and have a look, and Clarence had taken him to the field to see it personally. After that, he was visited every day by curious townfolk wanting to see this miraculous pumpkin. They were never unsupervised, of course. As he spent more and more time with the pumpkin, Clarence was becoming quite protective of it. He began to worry that this was as large as it was going to get, topping out just shy of 5 feet, and he started increasing the amount of blood he gave it. He was back to cutting his palm for the fat red drops he'd gotten before, but even that didn't make it grow. The ground drank, but the whispers never happened. Clarence slept poorly, beginning to neglect his other crops, and Fritz the blood pumpkin became somewhat of an obsession. On the 4th of October, Clarence got the visit he'd been expecting. He called on him early, just a short series of knocks that drug him from the table where he'd been listlessly eating his breakfast. He was dressed in overalls and a blue work shirt, boots with run-down heels after many years of use, and a round-top brown hat that was probably meant to make him look like a cowboy, but just made him look more like a farmer from a John Wayne movie. He hadn't taken the hat off, and just stood grinning on the front porch as though they were the best of friends. "David," Clarence said, hiding his mistrust behind a grin, "what brings you all the way out here this early?" "Well, I'd heard tell that I might have a spot to worry about this year. Seems like you've got a real contender on your hands. Mind if I get a look?" Clarence sniffed, sure that he'd heard all kinds of things. Clarence was sure he'd seen pictures and heard gossip, but in the end, Decker decided that he really wanted a look at this miraculous pumpkin. As sure as Decker was, Clarence was just as sure that he didn't want him to see his blood pumpkin. Maybe it was jealousy, maybe it was mean-spirited, but he felt like it might be something else. Clarence was pretty sure that the pumpkin didn't want Decker to see it. "Sorry, David, you want to see my pumpkin, you'll have to wait till the contest." Clarence swung the door closed, the conversation at an end, just like the pleasantries, and found the tip of one of those run-down boots blocking the way. "Come on now, just a peek. Hell, you let half the town see it, so what's the harm in letting me have a gander?" "I said no, David," Clarence said, his voice a little harder than he strictly meant it to be. "You can see it in 3 weeks, when it's got a blue ribbon attached to it." He moved his foot then, allowing Clarence to close the door, but when he nodded his head and showed him a big grin, Clarence knew it wasn't a genuine smile like he'd seen before. "Suit yourself, then. I'm sure I'll see it in due time." He was right, of course, but seeing would prove to be Decker's undoing. He got his look 3 nights later. Clarence stiffened when he heard the sound of someone cursing softly. He was in bed, his wife snoring peacefully beside him. He had been unable to sleep, his eyes making a map of the dark topography of the ceiling, when he heard the noise from the yard. It could have been the wind, but he knew it wasn't. Clarence felt himself getting out of bed and walking down the hall as he made his way into the kitchen. He moved around the dark table and stood in the screen door as he gazed at the shadowy east field. It was late, midnight by the clock on the stove, and there would have been no way for Clarence to see anyone in the field at all. Standing in the dark kitchen, though, he became very sure that he could see someone walking into the field. carrying something with a long handle. Clarence sleepwalked from the house, silent as a ghost, and though the October wind sent goosebumps up his bare arms, he hardly noticed. As he passed by the woodpile, his hands clambered out to wrap around the old, splintery axe that sat beside the ancient stump. As he approached, Clarence saw the person staring at the pumpkin, staring at Fritz, and in the moonlight, it was easy to see them transfixed by the silhouette of that swollen gourd. They stood stock still, contemplating the next thing they meant to do, and Clarence was less than 30 feet away when they raised the tool and swung it down into the pumpkin with a wet, meaty thunk. Clarence screamed in anguish as he ran, bare feet slapping the earth as he churned up the ground. The person must have heard him, because they turned mid-swing. In the moonlight, Clarence failed to register the round-crowned hat and the face full of white, snarling teeth. In his rage, it didn't matter who it was. He had hurt his pumpkin, and now he would end him. He buried the axe in their chest, blade biting into the wood of the hoe, which they had tried to block the swing with, and as the wood splintered, he saw the blood splash across his undershirt. David Decker looked at him with stunned and unbelieving eyes, but those eyes didn't fill with fear until something wrapped around his ankle. His blood had fallen on the ground between them, and even now the earth was drinking it greedily. He turned drunkenly, axe still buried in his chest, and as he did, he fell to the ground as the blood began to bubble from his lips. The red fell on the face of that unholy gourd, and Clarence saw it grow and writhe before his very eyes. Its vines twined around him, long stalks wrapping him like the coils of a monstrous snake, and all at once the earth began to writhe and churn as its roots came up to join its tendrils. In his terror, David struggled. His hands lashed out feebly with the broken hoe as he was dragged beneath the soil. Clarence watched as he disappeared into the earth and seemed to come back to himself as his rival disappeared. He felt his knees unhinge all at once and was knee-bound on the soil. As the roots began to slide over him as well, his mind just slipped away as the shadow of the blood pumpkin fell across him, now 6 or 7 feet tall and 5 or 6 feet wide. He could hear it growing and groaning. It grew with a sound like a thin tree in a high wind, and as Clarence blacked out, he never expected to have another thought on God's green earth besides that last. He thought that maybe he had finally made his sacrifice, and that this pumpkin would take him into the earth as its next meal. It might have been kinder if it had. Clarence woke up in the field with his wife standing over him. The pumpkin, that 7-foot-tall behemoth of orange skin and green vines, towered over them both. His shirt was clean, the ground undisturbed, and all signs pointed to the night's events being just a dream, except for the broken hoe and the ugly little scar on the left side of Fritz where the hoe had bitten into him. David Decker was never seen again. The sheriff found his truck not far from the farm, and he came by one afternoon to ask Clarence some questions. The old sheriff sat at the table as his wife sat out lunch, tipping his cigarette ash into a saucer as Mrs. Clarence shot him dark looks for stinking up her kitchen. He asked all the expected questions. Had they seen him? Had he been here? And did Clarence know anything about his disappearance? Clarence told him no. He told him that he had seen David yesterday, but he had left and gone wherever it was he had returned to. Clarence couldn't very well tell him that one of the pumpkins had eaten Decker up and stay out of the nut house. Sheriff made some notes, but ultimately dumped his ash into the garbage can and took his leave. He said the visit was just a courtesy anyway, and that they wouldn't keep Clarence from his harvest. The harvest that year was tremendous. The blood pumpkin wasn't the only thing that had benefited from David's sacrifice, and the yield that year was so great that Clarence could have bought his own stand without the money from winning the contest. That hardly mattered to him, though. Nothing really mattered at that point. By that time, Clarence didn't care about anything but the pumpkin and keeping it happy. October 15th, 5 days before the contest, he began to notice a change in Fritz. Though still connected to the ground and still 7 feet tall, it was beginning to take on a definite sag. It was waxy looking, possessed of an over-ripeness, and Clarence had serious doubts that it would make it to the fair. The blood would no longer sustain it, and whatever it had gotten from David was gone now. It appeared another sacrifice was required, but Clarence didn't have the strength to catch its food for it. The pumpkin was his obsession, but he just didn't have the resolve to feed his neighbors to it. He was sitting at the kitchen table one morning, trying to figure out what to do, when Providence provided. Though unwilling to lure victims for his monstrous gourd, he couldn't stand the idea that it would be lost so soon. To have come so far and stumbled at the finish line was unthinkable, but to give the pumpkin the sacrifice it desired was equally as barbaric. Clarence had no clue what to do, and even from here, he could see the pumpkin waning. It had grown so large that he could see it from almost any place that overlooked the backyard, and the sight of it was awe-inspiring. Had there ever been such a pumpkin as this? Had anyone ever grown a pumpkin so grand? And now, he was just going to let it die. He was weighing his options when the knock came at the door. Clarence shuffled numbly to the door, and to his surprise, he found Reggie standing on the front porch, wiping sweat from his brow and smiling hugely. Reggie, the only one left in town who hadn't come to see the pumpkin. "Thought it was time that I came for a look. They say in town that this pumpkin's something to see." Clarence nodded, a wad of cotton resting in his throat, as an opportunity presented itself before his very eyes. His wife was out visiting a sick friend. The usual crowds had dissipated for now, and this was the first day in weeks he hadn't had to play tour guide. It was just Reggie and Clarence, and he wanted to see the pumpkin, the one he'd heard so much about around the stand. Reggie had walked from his farm a few blocks away. He'd probably told no one where he was going. Clarence offered him a glass of tea as he walked through the kitchen, and then he took him to the east field so he could marvel at the pumpkin. As he gawped in disbelief, Clarence slipped his hand into his pocket. "This is wild. Granddad said they were big, but this is huge." Clarence wrapped a hand around the buck knife he'd used to feed it his own blood. Even if Decker hadn't disappeared, I'm pretty sure that even he couldn't have grown something this big. Reggie had his back to him, and he didn't see the knife slide out. "What have you been feeding this thing? Granddad said it took a sacrifice, but you must have spent a lot of time out here." He was so lost in his own ramblings, he didn't hear the metallic click as the knife came open. "Unless you've been making actual sacrifices out here in the east field," he said, jokingly. "What's your secret, buddy? Virgin blood? Goat's blood? A little full moon?" He stopped talking when the knife slipped into the side of his neck, stopped talking, and started gurgling. The ground accepted him, and when his wife got home from her friend's house, the pumpkin was 12 feet tall. A week later, the judges came to Clarence's house to see Fritz the behemoth. Clarence won the contest, hands down. It wasn't even a contest. The judges couldn't find a pumpkin even half as large as this, and when Mrs. Clarence came for her yearly sacrifice for the pie contest, he gave her the other 3 instead. She seemed disappointed. Perhaps she had noticed what a mania this pumpkin had become for her husband, but she took them anyway, and won the pie contest that year with the tastiest pie the judges had ever had. As she left the field, her arms laden with pumpkins, Clarence first heard the slithery voice of the serpent as it offered its apple. The voice was autumn wind and winter promises, but he had heard it before, hadn't he? It was the voice that tells the farmer he can squeeze one more crop before the winter. The voice that tells the prideful that it won't be that cold tonight, so there's no need to bring the livestock in. It's the voice of creeping winter that hungers for its sacrifice. The voice told Clarence that if it gave the field his wife, his fame would be eternal. On that day, Clarence turned away from it. On that day, he was strong. The sounds of laughing children and swaying scarecrows filled the air as the plastic flags snapped in the breeze. The annual pumpkin patch was something that Clarence looked forward to with great anticipation, and this year he had a prize-winning pumpkin to display amongst the others. He had always played second fiddle to David Decker and his pumpkin patch, but this year, Clarence was the star of the show. It appeared there was a new local celebrity, though Clarence suspected that it was the gargantuan that sat behind the little fence in the patch that people had come to see. Clarence had arrayed the smaller pumpkins for sale, and even Hercules sat amongst them since he'd been spared the pie. The people milled about the patch, looking in awe at Fritz the behemoth as they made their choices. Clarence was at the card table where they sat the cash box, his wife playing the dutiful hostess out in the fields. From his vantage point behind the table, Clarence saw the kid when he stepped a little too close to the massive pumpkin. He wanted to say something to him, tell the kid to back up, but he hesitated as he watched him waddle closer. Look at the kid. He was a porker. He was a hefty kid from a family of hefty adults, and he had stopped to stare at the pumpkin as he held one of his smaller cousins in his pudgy hand. All at once, he shifted the pumpkin under his arm and stepped towards the monstrous gourd with a hand outstretched to touch. Clarence wanted to say something, should have stopped the kid before he could get any closer, but as Clarence started to raise his voice to warn him, he heard the voice of the serpent again, asking him to stand aside, commanding him to stand aside. The mustached man cleared his throat at Clarence, and Clarence sat back down. He reached for the man's money, his eyes straying to the boy as he laid one fat pink starfish hand against the red skin of the monster. He cast his eyes away, but even that didn't save him from witnessing the end. The kid went into the ground without a sound, and when the pumpkin shattered on the ground next to the gargantuan one, no one was the wiser. The police were called when the absence was noticed, and they searched the field and the forest beyond for weeks without finding a thing. The boy's parents sat at the kitchen table, his mother crying into a square of silk as Clarence's wife poured tea and assured her he'd turn up. She had kept right on assuring her of that until 10 o'clock that night. Clarence was lucky his wife was such a hostess, because all he could do was sit, shell-shocked in a chair, as she puttered around and made small talk. Everyone thought he was broken up about the kid, and in a way, they were right. After all, it's not every day you watch a kid get pulled into the soil while no one's looking. Clarence saw the flashlight lights from the inside of the tent as the fair raged outside. They had given him his own circus tent to draw in the crowd, and Clarence had no lack of people wanting to see the pumpkin. It wasn't every day you got to see a 20-foot-tall pumpkin, and he'd been making the circuit for the better part of 4 months. People were always amazed that the pumpkin stayed so fresh, so alive, but Clarence knew the reason. The best fertilizer always seemed to walk through the flap of his tent, didn't it? He won the contest the year after the kid had disappeared, too. People said he had a knack for growing pumpkins, but really, it was the same one. When it got 18 feet tall and 12 feet wide, it started to attract tourists from some of the local hollers. Some of them never made it back to wherever they had been from either, but the wrecker never asked too many questions when they came to tow their cars. By that point, Clarence was numb to the sacrifice. The pumpkin ate, the pumpkin grew, and as the tourists began to pay to see it, Clarence found that he didn't have to be a farmer anymore. The pumpkin made his farm a natural spot for tourists on the road, and they never grumbled too much about a few dollars here and there to see it. That was how he came to be on the road and in this tent. The man in the suit had offered him a startling amount of money if he'd go on the road with his gourd, and Clarence knew he'd be a fool if he didn't take him up on it. They loaded it up on a flatbed and took it to the county fair after county fair so the whole state could see the world's biggest pumpkin. They did it for 5 years, and in those 5 years, Clarence remembered hearing about a suspected serial killer plaguing the state. They dubbed him the County Fair Kidnapper, and in 5 years he abducted more than 20 children and 5 adults from state fairs across the state. The state police even questioned Clarence, though not as a suspect. They wanted to see if he'd seen anything amiss, and he always told them no. He hardly had a choice, after all. If he'd suddenly told them that his prize-winning pumpkin was eating people at an alarming rate, they'd have slapped him in the loony bin. Clarence knew he wasn't blameless in the whole affair, but the pumpkin was good for his family. The pumpkin was good for the town, after all. In truth, the massive pumpkin in Clarence's east field was the only thing that kept the town from being just another cow-flop Midwestern nothing. The pumpkin brought in the crowds, and the crowds stopped in at the cafe to have a bite. They stopped at the gas station for gas and road snacks. They stopped at the farmer's market to buy fresh produce. They spread their money up and down the street from May till November, and the town always had a corn maze or a fair to draw some of it away from the pumpkin and back into the town proper. At one point, Clarence's face and a picture of the pumpkin were even on the town sign when you drove over the city limits. "Come see the world's biggest pumpkin," it stated, in bold black letters, and at one point, you could damn near see the thing from the city outskirts. In its heyday, it towered nearly 30 feet high and was wider than the farmhouse. By this time, Clarence was blind to its feedings for the most part. Hell, by this point, Clarence was complicit in the murders. He had killed 2 for Fritz already, and was responsible for all the rest as far as he was concerned. He had turned aside, hadn't he? He was content to sit in his lawn chair by the fence and charge people for the opportunity to stand at the base of the giant and feel small in the shadow of a pumpkin. Unfortunately, Clarence had made the same mistake that many men in his position make. He had lived in the shadow of the dragon for so long that he believed he was safe, that his family was safe. It depended on him, after all, and he believed that he and his family were safe from that slithering grasp. Even after 5 years, he didn't really grasp its slyness, its cunning, until it finally took someone that he couldn't turn away from. It happened suddenly, but the horror of it would never leave him, no matter how long he lived. He was standing in the back door, watching her work in the garden. He was trying to ignore the creeping voice as it told him it needed to feed. She was out in the field, tending some vegetables in the space he no longer used, and as he watched her, he began to wonder if he might resist this evil and win free. Clarence had been this pumpkin's puppet for nearly 8 years. 8 long years of dragging its burden around his neck, and his heart was growing heavy with the burden of that sin. As he watched her in her purity and love, he began to think that he might escape this evil thing and be the man he once was. They could leave, just pack their things and go. They could leave this cursed earth behind them as they went out to start anew somewhere else. She'd noticed something was off, likely noticed from the start that something was off, but she was dutiful. She was obedient. She loved him more than he could ever love her. He would never have let her go near that field again if he had. She was coming in, carrying a basket of produce, and he would always remember the way she smiled when she saw him. Her face, that old young face of hers, stretched into a smile as she raised her hand to wave. Clarence had raised his hand to return her wave, had it half cocked, but it died on his wrist when she dropped into the earth. Dropped. That was the right word. She didn't sink. She wasn't pulled. It was as though a hole had opened up and swallowed her in one gulp. Her basket fell, tumbling vegetables across the dirt, and it was all the evidence that existed that she had been there at all. Clarence hitched in his breath as he stared at those rolling vegetables, the scream of rage and pain nearly ripping his throat apart as it rocketed into the world. It laughed at him as he dug up the field. Clarence dug it up in furious, crumping sweeps of the shovel, but he never found a trace of her. He stayed out there digging until well past moonrise, with only Fritz for company. She was the last sacrifice he was a part of. She was the last meat that Fritz didn't have to catch for himself. This was also the last time Clarence tried to square up with that terrible giant. It was black dark when he went inside, and it was past midnight when he stood in the shadow of the pumpkin again. He was drunk, weaving and bleary, and in his hand was a tin holder with a rag in the neck. Clarence had concocted this plan as he crawled head first into a jug of corn whiskey, and it was the best plan that he could think of. The coal oil would burn hot and bright, and when he threw it on the pumpkin, it caught immediately. He sat back and watched as the flames ate the fuel, but the pumpkin did nothing but laugh at his futile efforts. The slithering voice told him that he couldn't kill it that easy. It told him that the two were stuck together now, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. It had been wrong on that last account, or so Clarence hoped. He set up a fence after that, and never let the tourists come close again. They could pay their money, and they could observe from a distance, but no one was allowed to go into the field again. It cawed at him as Clarence sat in the chair by the fence. It said that this was a useless gesture, that it couldn't stop him if he wanted them, but he ignored it. He kept his vigil, kept his silence, and as the two lived, the town shriveled around them. It had gotten too powerful, too evil to be contained, and those who spent time close to it became susceptible to its voice. They came in the night, and they died silently in the field as they were drawn into the earth. The sheriff, the owner of the feed store, the girl who served the coffee at the diner, they all came to the field to give their lives to the gourd. Clarence tried to stop them, but no matter what he tried or how he fought, they all came to the gourd and gave it their life's blood. The town was deserted, a ghost town in a country full of ghost towns, and the only thing to see was Fritz. Fritz, the world's oldest pumpkin. They're both shriveled now, a couple of relics from a bygone age, and those who come to see them usually say how they saw Big Fritz when they were kids. Clarence still keeps his vigil, but the pumpkin's a lot more manageable now. He sits in a glass case, small and red and angry, and those who stand around looking too long always come away with headaches. For $5, you can get your selfie and have a pamphlet on the ninth wonder of the world, but the crowds have mostly gone now. He's a shriveled old thing, small as he was before Clarence gave him his first drop of blood, but if you spend too long in his company, you can hear his creaky old voice. You can start to feel his influence in your head. Spend too much time around him, and one night he might just draw you into the field. I had never met the guy before that night, and what my friends and I did was extremely foolish. Given the crowd we rolled with, it was fortunate that we didn't end up as ghosts ourselves. I was part of the goth scene in high school. These were the prime years of Hot Topic fashion, where every town had a garage band that played scene music, and every school had a little collection of black-clad figures who smoked out behind the gym. I was a poster child for goth culture. Eyeliner, hair like an oversprayed raven wing, fishnets, combat boots, the whole 9 yards. The school hated our little clique, mostly due to truancy and the little pile of butts we left out behind the gym, but we didn't care. It was all part of the aesthetic, right? October may have meant costumes and candy when we were younger, but now that we were older, October was 30 days of celebration. On any given afternoon, my friends and I could wander downtown and hear someone telling spooky stories on the corner, take part in a ghost tour, or listen to someone playing a saw or something spooky with scavenged instruments. Downtown had a sizable artistic scene, and October was also their month to cash in on the semi-spooky history of the town. Pinkerton Dock, the park where some witches had been burned, the old gallows by the courthouse, the Rikers Hotel, they all had a history of ghosts and spooky occurrences. Sometimes we would just walk around in our dark clothes and heavy makeup, adding to the ambience. So, when the posters appeared at our favorite coffee shop, Dark Brew, announcing a Halloween concert for the local band Burning Ramses, we all planned to be there. We were sitting towards the back, the air heavy with the smell of clove cigarettes and the fruity smell of smuggled vodka, when the man in the vest suddenly approached our table. I was sitting with Catherine and Margot, Tobias and Clyde sitting on the other side, and we had just started discussing what we would do after the concert. Clyde thought that we should go to the old Leaback place, the most haunted spot in town, and see if we could spot some ghosts. Margot wanted to go drinking at Pinehurst Cemetery, something that was a shock to no one. Margot was already 3 sheets to the wind and seemed to be destined for a life of barely functional alcoholism. Tobias was just suggesting that maybe we could check out the trail on the next town over where those kids had been murdered back in the 80s, when the guy seemed to appear between he and Catherine before speaking up. It wouldn't have been so strange. The place was packed, but Kat and Tobias were sitting against the back wall. "If you guys are looking for something spooky to do, you should come out to Habersham Cemetery with me." We all jumped and looked at him, clearly startled by his sudden appearance. He was older than we were, somewhere between 20 and 30, wearing dark jeans and a leather vest covered in patches from shows he'd been to. I didn't recognize any of the patches, but I thought I recognized the man. I'd seen him at shows before, one of those guys who likes to hover around the back, and the left side of his head had a weird burn on it, like someone had pressed his face against a radiator. That side was hairless, and he had swooped the rest of his corn silk hair over it to hide the spot. It drew more attention to it, ruining the attempt to hide it, and the longer I looked at him, the more he looked like a skeleton someone had squeezed into scene kid clothes. Hearing him talk now was a little odd. I had expected his voice to be something like a hiss or carry a stutter. We would all be surprised later that we hadn't just told him to leave, which would stick with me. We had been enchanted by him, held by some kind of glamour, and when Tobias asked what he meant, it seemed like he had only been waiting for someone to ask. "Habersham Cemetery is supposed to be as old as the town itself. It's lost in the woods near Terry Mill, and I watched a corpse dance there last year." I leaned in to hear, wanting him to go on, but he stood up and pointed at the door with his thumb. "I could tell you all about it, but why tell you when I can show you? It happens at midnight on Halloween night, and if I want to see it, I need to get moving. You can come with me if you want. It's definitely something to see." He pushed past Catherine and headed for the door, clearly not caring if we followed him or not, and the five of us looked at each other in silent conference. It sounded fun, but none of us knew this guy. Clyde thought his name might be Steve, but he had never talked to him. Clyde was interested in seeing what was at the cemetery, and Tobias thought he had heard of the place before. "It's supposed to be wild, like it feels like there might be real magic there, I heard." After a short discussion, it was unanimously decided that we would follow him out there. Catherine added that there were 5 of us, and even if he was a creep, he didn't look very intimidating. The man was a scarecrow, and 5 older teens could easily jump him if he decided to get weird. So after we roused Margot and got her shakily to her feet, we all set out after the weird guy before he could get too far ahead. He looked up when we walked out, enjoying a cigarette on the sidewalk, and his smile was broad and genuine. "Glad you guys decided to join me. Looks like I might need a ride." He pointed to an empty parking spot nearby and explained how his van had been towed while he was inside. "Guess my tags were a little more expired than I thought. Think I could catch a ride with you guys? I don't mind hitchhiking back if you don't want to come back with me." This elicited a new huddle. I had a Ford Focus that would be lucky to hold 4 people, and Kat and Margot had ridden with me. Luckily, Clyde had a Jeep and figured he could easily put all 6 of us in the vehicle. We decided that Tobias and Catherine would sit on either side of this guy in the back, just to make sure he didn't try anything weird. Tobias was a softy, but he was nearly 6 feet tall, and was muscled through the shoulders from working on his dad's farm all his life. Catherine was a waif by comparison, but the whole group had seen her put guys twice her size on their asses more than once, and we felt confident that the 2 of them could keep the guy from getting too crazy. Nodding, we broke and told him he could ride in the back, as long as he could give us directions. He introduced himself as Steve, and took his seat graciously before telling Clyde to hop on the main road and head out of town. We rode in silence past the town sign, the silence getting awkward until Tobias finally couldn't take it anymore. "So, I don't think I've ever been to Habersham Cemetery. What's the deal with it?" "Habersham Cemetery is beautiful, but it's been kinda lost to time," Steve explained. "It's owned by the old Habersham family, though they're all gone now. They were dancers. Did you know that? Their whole family was in the ballet or the theater, until one day their bloodline just kinda dwindled out. The old cemetery is really the only sign that they were ever here at all. When I was in school, my friends and I would go out there to hang out a lot. My friend Trevor had discovered it as a kid, and we used to get drunk and smoke there whenever we all got together. It sounds weird, but that's where I got my first kiss, where I took my first drink, and the place I have the happiest memories of." "Why aren't these friends going out there with you then?" asked Kat, her tone not really accusing, but more curious than anything. "Oh, they just don't really hang out with me anymore. People get older, they kinda drift apart. Life happens and people grow separate. You guys will figure that out one day." At the time, I remember thinking this wouldn't happen to us, but everyone knows how that usually works out. For the moment, we were on an adventure, and that was what was important. Steve bumped Clyde's headrest softly, pointing towards an access road as it swam into the headlights, and he told him to take it. It's at the end of the access road. It should only take about 10 minutes to get there from here. I checked my watch and saw that it was pushing 11. We should make it in plenty of time, but I hope this wasn't just a creative means to lure us out into the woods. This guy seemed at ease as he sat between Catherine and Tobias, but some people could turn on a dime like that. He could be as quiet as a mouse until he transformed into a lion and stabbed us all to death out there in the woods. The trees slid by in the soupy glass of Clyde's windshield, and as we came to the cul-de-sac at the end of the access road, Clyde slowed down and stopped in the middle. The area was open, carved out and rolled smooth as they prepared to raise new houses here. At the moment, the pristine land just looked barren and lonely, and Clyde looked back at Steve to make sure this was the place. "It's in the woods behind this. Come on," he said, looking at his two bookends to see who would get out first. As it happened, Tobias climbed out first, and Steve followed him as Clyde turned off the Jeep and killed the headlights. It was dark, the moon little more than a silvery thought, but luckily Clyde had some flashlights in the back. Steve had his own headlamp in his back pocket, and as we dug out the lights, he slid it on and waited for us to get ready. Margot had sobered up a little and was complaining about how she didn't want to go tromping out into the woods at night. We debated just leaving her there, but as Clyde slid an arm around her, she perked up and prepared to walk into the trees with him. Margot had a pretty obvious crush on Clyde, but she seemed the only one who hadn't guessed that Tobias would be more up Steve's alley. The only one who might have been more surprised to learn that was Clyde himself. Steve headed off into the woods as we checked our lights, his headlamp bobbing between the scrubby trees surrounded by flat and unnatural landscape. He called back to us, telling us to get the lead out if we wanted to see it, and we came along with our flashlights bobbing and Margot swaying as Clyde tried manfully to keep her upright. The night sounds around us seemed way louder than they had been in the city. The crickets chirped and reed happily. The bats tittered and flapped overhead. The frogs sounded off in the depths of the woods, and as the wind rustled, it sounded like the trees themselves were welcoming us. The leaves of last year rattled skeletally on the branches as they chimed in the winter, and the deeper we went, the more lonely the place seemed. It felt like we had entered the graveyard long before I saw the crumbling stone and iron walls that surrounded it. "Welcome to Habersham Cemetery," Steve said grandly. "Here lies the entirety of the Habersham line, save for the last 2 generations who are buried in Mount Christos. I've spent some of the best times of my life here, times I'll never recapture again." He checked his watch and beckoned us inside. Someone had set up a couch under the overhang of trees, and I had a sneaking suspicion I knew who it was. Margot flopped onto the old couch, sending up a cloud of dust and dead leaves, and Tobias sat gingerly beside her as he tested the old couch for bugs or rats. Clyde leaned against a gravestone, and Kat hopped up on a stone marker that was as big as a coffee table. Steve was looking out towards the middle, an area without markers that seemed marred by a few hasty little hillocks. I wondered again if this was the place he meant to kill us, maybe bury us in this long-forgotten graveyard. I doubted it, but it was a thought that wouldn't quite leave. I pushed it aside and went to stand near him, curious about why he had us all here in the first place. "Your van didn't really get towed, did it?" I asked. I expected he would lie, but he surprised me with his candor. "I wasn't as smooth with that one as I thought, was I?" "No, truth is, I usually ask someone to take me out here. Sometimes it's a friend, sometimes it's a stranger, and sometimes I just end up walking. Make no mistake, though, I end up at this cemetery before midnight every year." "And how many Halloweens has that been?" He seemed to consider, but I didn't think he really had to think too hard about it. "About 11. I think maybe this one might be number 12. "And why is this so important that you walk here every Halloween?" I had gotten past the idea that he meant to kill us, but I was still curious about the locale and the reason for coming here. Surely we weren't going to see corpses dance out here. "Well, I think I got time for a story. You see, I used to come out here when I was in middle school with my friends. Davy had found the place, and when he showed Heather, Mark, and I, we thought it was about the coolest place ever. We brought Sandra out here when she and Mark met in high school. By that point, It was our regular hangout spot. We used to come out here every Halloween and tell scary stories and eat candy, drink beer, just relax, you know. I had my first time on that grave marker your friend's sitting on, and afterwards I looked at Heather and knew that she was the only girl I ever wanted to be with. He looked wistfully at the old hillocks, and I realized that there were 4 of them out there. The thought piqued my curiosity, but it also rekindled a little of my mistrust. Then one night, I messed it all up. An alarm went off on his watch, and he looked down as he wrung his hands. Any minute now. He watched the mounds in the middle of the boneyard, continuing his story as he waited for the show to begin. We were coming back from a show one night, all of us drunk or stoned or some combination of the two. A deer ran out in front of my van, and I swerved to miss it. The van skidded, and I went off into the ravine. It wasn't very deep, but I think I was the only one wearing a seatbelt. My friends bounced around in the van like popcorn. When we came to rest at the bottom, I slipped off for a while. When I came to, 3 of them were already dead. I sometimes wish that Heather had been one of them, but it did mean that I got to say goodbye. I heard something rustle out in the graveyard and looked at the 4 mounds that Steve was marking so attentively. I had a burn on the side of my face from something. I was never quite sure what, but it was bad enough that I'd never forget it. As bad as it was, though, Heather was worse. She was beaten all to hell, laying on what would have been the ceiling and pulling in breath like she had broken ribs and they were in her lungs. She was looking at me, and when I saw her, I unclipped my seatbelt and fell to my knees beside her. Despite her protest, I pulled her onto my lap, and as she lay dying in my arms, I could hear her whispering something again and again. I leaned in close, just as the blue and white lights reflected inside the van, as she whispered her request one final time before passing on. I hardly heard him as he laid it all out. The earth around the mounds had begun to shift, the earth running in rivulets. A dark finger had wormed its way from the closest grave, and an arm was inching out to join it. The top of a head appeared from the ground, and the blonde hair was ragged like old yarn. Steve grinned as he looked at the face below the hair, sniffling a little as she pulled herself free, revealing a corpse in a black dress. The other 3 wore formal wear, suits or dresses that looked like they'd never seen more than a week above ground. I took a step away, feeling like someone stuck in a George Romero film as I watched them shuffle out like sleepwalkers. "What in the hell?" I asked, and I heard Kat squeak in uncharacteristic fear as she nearly tumbled off the marker stone. Clyde had taken a step towards me, Margot clutching at his arm as she screamed like a fire alarm. Clyde was clutching at something as Margot clutched at him, and I could see that it was a jagged piece of gravestone. Steve stepped in front of him, waving his arms as he begged for him not to hurt them. "They won't hurt anybody. They've never hurt anybody. Just watch." As if they had only been waiting for him to speak, all 4 took up poses and began to rotate in a slow circle. They moved to a tune that only they could hear, and they turned and moved like dancers caught in a familiar bit of choreography. They were helpless, moved by something unearthly, and their dance had turned into something grotesque as I noticed their injuries. Their clothes hid the bones that must be poking through their skin, but I could clearly see that one of the boys, a big blonde one with football player shoulders, had a broken leg that he was dancing on heedlessly. One of the girls had a head that looked mushy, and the one that I had first seen come out of the ground had a bob to her neck that made it seem like it no longer wanted to support her. The 4 moved with graceless precision, spinning as they moved in a circle, grasping hands as they came together in the center. "What the hell is this?" Tobias asked, sounding angry as he got off the couch and walked towards Steve. "Dancing corpses, just as I told you." "Yeah, but we didn't expect to actually see them. We thought, Clyde stammered. "Thought what? That I was putting you on? That I was messing with a group of kids? That I meant to drag you out here so I could kill you or rob you? Then why did you come out here at all? Why would you come out here with a complete stranger if you didn't believe what I was saying?" We couldn't really argue with that. He was right. We'd gone into the woods with a perfect stranger. And for what? Had any of us really believed that we would see dancing corpses? We knew that such things didn't really happen, but here we were. watching 4 rotting corpses dance like tired ballet performers. Clyde went back to the couch, Margot clutching his arm, and we all sat in rapture as we watched their performance. As they turned and moved, I could see that Steve had eyes only for the blonde with the broken neck. He followed her as she spun, smiling whenever her eyes happened upon his. It was hard not to imagine that her rotten lips twisted a little in pleasure, and I felt like I already knew who she was before I asked. "Heather?" I asked, but he put a hand up to stop me. After the dance is over. I'll finish the story then, but for now, just let me watch." I nodded and turned back to see the corpses leaping like deer, their legs groaning in agony as their bones tried to hold them up. Suddenly there were others in the old boneyard, alabaster spirits, their bodies too decomposed to rise and dance, spun around the shambling dancers. Their movements were expert, their bright leotards and costumes from 1,000 different performances, and they complemented the dancing bodies expertly. The dance was one they knew, a dance they had all danced for generations, and as his watch beeped again, all the dancers suddenly stopped and turned to look at us. It was strange having the eyes of the living dead on you, and as they all bowed politely, the ghosts dissipated in a shower of stars. The 4 corpses, however, simply fell to the ground and moved no more. "Shame it only lasts 15 minutes, Steve sighed. "Okay, I waited till the end of the dance. Now, how about you fill me in on the rest?" I said, my curiosity getting the better of me. "Sure, but first I need to put my old friends back to bed." He went into the woods and came back with 4 shovels. "It'll go faster if you help me, but I understand if you'd rather not." I took the offered shovel, and Clyde reached for one as well. Tobias took some coaxing, but he finally grabbed the other when Catherine sighed and went to take it. Margot just sat on the couch, her eyes closed and her breathing gentle. Clyde told us that it had all been a little too much for her, and he'd watched her faint just as the dead people started to dance. Kat came over to help us anyway, and as we worked, Steve finished his story, bringing the others to speed before continuing. "Heather said she wanted to be buried here, but it wasn't the first time she'd asked it. We were in the graveyard on the last Halloween of her life, watching the ghosts dance and twirl, when she asked me to bury her here when she died. I looked at her oddly, asking why she would want to be buried here, and she told me that she liked the idea of dancing with all the ghosts once a year. Coming back once a year to dance with all my friends sounds like a wonderful way to spend my death. The others must have heard her because they decided they wanted to be buried here too. By the end of the night, all of us had made a pact. We would all make sure that we were buried here, the last one alive making sure that the rest were buried here, one way or another." He rubbed the sweat off his forehead, climbing out of the hole as he prepared to put his friend back in it. "None of them thought they'd have to make good on that pact less than a year later. No teenager who's barely in their senior year thinks about their death as more than a distant idea. And suddenly it fell to me to make sure their wishes were honored. Their parents wouldn't hear a word I had to say. They blamed me for their children's death. I was drunk when we crashed after all, and I was barred from their funerals. I didn't know how I was going to do it, but I knew that if I ever wanted to see Heather again, I would need to fulfill my promise to them." "You didn't," I said, kind of wishing I hadn't asked. "Fortunately, they were buried in 2 different cemeteries. If I'd spent 12 hours in one, someone would have likely caught me for sure. Heather came first, then Mark. Then I got Davy and Sandra from the Presbyterian church, just as the sun came up. I had borrowed my dad's old truck and parked right around where your friend parked his Jeep. I brought them out here one at a time and buried them in the place they loved so much. I put them to rest where I knew they could rest easy, and when it was all done, I washed the evidence out of my dad's truck and parked it right where he had left it. The police came to question me, of course, but I was careful not to let anyone see me enter or leave the cemetery, or leave any evidence behind. In the end, they had to let me go, and I marked the days until Halloween." He lifted Heather into his arms, looking at her rotting face with love. "The first time I saw her dance, I was nearly scared shitless. I was out here drinking, keeping up the traditions that we had always held, but I don't think I actually thought they would dance. They weren't Habershams, and I would see nothing but the usual spooks as they capered. When they all drugged themselves up, I spilled my beer and thought they'd come to get me for disturbing their graves. When they began to dance, though, I was so happy. I felt that happiness falter, though, when I realized what it meant. He laid her in the ground again, and as he began to cover her with soil, he looked back with the saddest smile I'd ever seen. It meant that there was no one to lay me to rest in the cemetery when my time comes. I'll never dance with her, never be with her again, unless I have the courage to bury myself alive when the time comes. We were all gathered around the last grave, all of us besides Margot, and as he came out of the hole, he thanked us for helping him. Normally I'd offer you a beer, but I'm afraid I forgot to buy any this time. Clyde told him he thought it might be time for him to take Margot home, and Tobias said he needed to get home for chores the next day. Clyde had Margot over one shoulder, still snoring happily, and I saw Kat slide her hand into Tobias's as they left. I asked Steve if he needed a ride, but he just shook his head and leaned on his shovel. I think I'll stay for a little while. I prefer to spend Halloween with my friends, and I think we've got some catching up to do. We saw Steve a few more times over the years, and unfortunately his predictions had been true. Tobias and Catherine dated until college, when they both got accepted into separate schools. Clyde and Margot were an item for a while, mostly to get his strictly religious parents off his back, until he finally came out and moved to the Midwest somewhere with his secret boyfriend. I got tired of being used as a shoulder to cry on by Margot, and decided to go to college in the next state. I kept in touch with all of them, but we were never together again the way we were in high school. 10 years after I'd seen the dancing ghosts, I happened to be home for Halloween. I decided it might be nice to see them again. Maybe I wanted to prove that I'd actually seen it the first time. Maybe I just wanted to make sure the old place was still there. Maybe I just wanted to see Steve again. Whatever the reason, I found myself pulling up into the cul-de-sac about 11 o'clock that night, locking my car and walking into the woods. The area had grown back up. The lots had been cleared and never used. I had thought it might be hard to find a second time, but the trees looked exactly the same as I remembered them. When the gates loomed up, I saw they hadn't changed either, and I could already see the sagging old couch as it sat beside the fence. I expected that Steve would come wandering up at any minute, but as the time ticked closer to midnight, I figured this would be one performance he would miss. As I sat on the couch, my watch chimed midnight, and the earth began to stir. The original 4 corpses were still there, but they were mostly skeletons now. Their bones were broken and cracked, but they still danced as they had on that night a decade ago. They groaned and creaked as they danced and spun, but the corpse who crawled out of Heather's grave looked a little fresher. He was wearing the same black vest I'd seen him in that night, and though dirty, I could still make out some of the band patches. The ghosts joined them, and I marveled once again at the intricate dance they moved within. I didn't know how long he had been there, but it appeared that Steve had found the courage he was talking about to chase the woman he loved. When they flopped to the ground, I got up and found the shovels again. It appeared they would need someone else to lay them to rest this year. I wondered who would put them in the ground next year, or whether they would simply bake in the sun the day after their performance. I think maybe that was when I decided it was time to move back home. I could do worse than teach English in my old high school, drink coffee at the old coffee shop, and watch the corpses dance on Halloween. Who knows, maybe I'll even find some teenagers to invite out here one night, so they can have something to remember when their high school days are behind them. Maybe they too will come back to see one last performance by the Habersham dance. Come on, Dad, let's go! Lily stomped a slipper-clad foot on the sidewalk as she looked back at her father. She was ready to go trick-or-treating, and it seemed like nothing but Josh was standing in the way of her sweet treats. He was sitting on the front step of his childhood home, a well-loved cul-de-sac teeming with costumed children. The moon hung overhead, a ghostly sickle that presided over this Halloween night, and her dad was sitting with his back against the smooth stairs, as he found his eyes tracking the multitudes as they passed. The children laughed and screamed as they stalked by, the street a sea of superheroes, video game characters, colorful animals, and everything in between. He let his eyes drift past the excited pageantry, though. He was looking for one shape in particular. Josh's mom smiled at him, slipping her hand into Lily's and giving her a little tug.
Come on, hun. Your dad's waiting for someone. We'll go trick-or-treating while he waits." Lily looked interested. "Who are you waiting for, Daddy?" Of course, she wouldn't have remembered from last year. She'd been excited about trick-or-treating, showing off her Wonder Woman costume, and swinging between her father and her mother's hands as they walked. However, Laura was 6 months pregnant this year, and had opted out of the hour drive to get to his mother's house. She had smiled at Josh knowingly as he left, and told him to tell her hi for her. Lily's grandmother smoothed her hair as it sat under the tall princess hat. "It's just an old friend, dear. Your father meets him here every year." "Well, you're gonna miss out on the candy," Lily said, her tone stating firmly that she wouldn't be sharing if he didn't come. Josh smiled. "That's okay, Lily. You go and have fun with Grandma, okay?" Lily just shrugged, her grandmother's tugging hand finally leading her towards the waiting cacophony of spooky delights. She glanced back as they walked onto the street, but was soon lost in the crowd and probably wouldn't remember anything about this conversation until next year. Josh leaned back, getting comfy as he waited for him to arrive. He did this every year, every Halloween after that first so many years ago. In many ways, the visits were what Josh looked forward to the most about Halloween. Sure, the candy was nice, the costumes were great, but seeing his friend was why he always came home for Halloween. No matter where Josh was, no matter what he was doing, he always came home for Halloween. This was the night he got to see him. This was the night that Josh got to see Snarf again. Snarf had been a mutt. He was a bull terrier mixed with a basset hound mixed with God only knew what else. They had grown up together. Snarf was just a puppy when Josh had got him, and he was Josh's best friend for many years. When Josh thought back on that time in his life, he was glad he had gotten Snarf when he did. Kindergarten had been a difficult time for him, and his sheltered upbringing hadn't really prepared him for suddenly being around so many children. He was awkward, and not what you would call popular. He had thick glasses, was overweight, and his isolation had made him painfully shy. The other kids who had gone to daycare and Cub Scouts and T-ball together, took one look at him and dismissed him as a social outcast. It was tough, being unwanted at the age of 5. His mom thought a dog might help Josh's confidence, or at least ease some of the loneliness. In many ways, Josh believed his mother had recognized that the funk he was in was partially her fault, and was trying to make amends. She worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and often Josh was left in the care of his grandmother. She loved him and always doted on him, but she wasn't always up for the games a 5-year-old would be interested in. Thinking about it over the years, Josh often thought that Snarf was a way for her to alleviate some of the guilt about leaving him alone. Whatever the reason, he had loved her for it. His mother found Snarf at the Humane Society. He was a little smiling ball of fluff, and when he put his feet against the glass, she had known that he would be perfect. He had been waiting for Josh when she had come to pick him up that day, and the boy's surprise had turned to joy as the wet puppy tongue slid over his face. They sat in the back seat the whole way home, the dog's head against his stomach, panting happily as Josh scratched him behind the ears. He was that rare animal whose temperament never led him to jump up on people or bark for no reason. His accidents were few and far between, and he was easy to house train. They called him Snarf because he had a deviation in his nose that caused him to make a snarfing sound rather than a proper bark. He was the best dog, the only one Josh had ever owned, and Josh had flourished with the help of his new companion. Snarf had gotten him out of the house, helping him shed some of the baby fat that had made him the subject of so much ridicule. He had also been a great icebreaker to help Josh introduce himself to some of the neighborhood kids. By the time he had entered 1st grade, Josh had a few pals, but none of them could hold a candle to his friendship with that wiggling little mass of fur and ears. He was eternally thankful for the time he'd gotten with Snarf, but it would never have been enough. Josh dumped a fistful of candy into each of their buckets, and the trio of Disney princesses said thank you as they ran to the next house in a flurry of skirts and sneakers. A pirate wandered up and gave him his best "Arg!" Josh rewarded him with a couple of full-size Snicker bars, and he thanked him before wobbling off on his fake peg leg. Josh kept scanning the crowd, unsure what was taking his friend so long this year. He was usually here by now, but he had been late before. He sat up a little as he saw a small ghost, 4 legs poking from below a bedsheet. When it turned and wagged its tail at a larger ghost who was walking behind it, Josh got comfortable again. He sat scanning around, hoping it wouldn't be too much longer. He'd sit here all night if he had to, though. Josh would sit here till midnight if it bought him 5 minutes with his buddy. Josh had Snarf for 5 years, and those 5 years were filled with mostly good times between a boy and his dog. Snarf was never a chewer or prone to digging holes, and Josh couldn't remember ever having to fill in a hole or run after him as he chased a cat. Snarf also knew where the boundaries of his home were, and Josh never saw him run out of the yard or get in the road after a car. He was a good boy, and the neighborhood loved him. He would likely have a long and happy life if it hadn't been for Josh. To this day, he blamed himself for what had happened to Snarf. It had all started when Reggie moved into the neighborhood. Reggie moved in when Josh was 10, and his family took up residence in the Cranston house. Mr. Cranston had died about a month before, and though his family hadn't been neighbors with them, Mr. Cranston was a nice old man who was known to the whole neighborhood. He had always had the best yard displays for Christmas or Halloween, and he had given out the best candy to trick-or-treaters. When the ambulance came to take him away one night, everyone had hoped for the best, but poor Mr. Cranston had died of a heart attack. Luckily, he had been on the phone with his daughter when it had happened, or who knows when they would have found him. So when a moving van came up the street bound for Mr. Cranston's old house, Josh and his friends had hopped on their bikes and went to check it out. Josh had a group of friends that he hung out with then. Terry, Walt, and Patrick lived in the same neighborhood as he did, and they'd been friends for years. When the new boy was seen unpacking boxes from the van, they introduced themselves and welcomed him to the neighborhood. He was a big kid, tall and muscular, and Josh had gotten a weird feeling about him almost at once. "I'm Josh," he said, extending a hand. "We were just about to go play some ball if you're interested." "Reggie," the boy said, squeezing his hand a little too hard, almost like he meant to hurt him. "Yeah, sounds like that might be fun." One short conversation was enough to let the boys know that Reggie's interests were different than theirs. Most of them had agreed later that they felt he probably wasn't going to be a good fit for the group, and not just because of his attitude. He had scoffed at their comic books, asked if they were babies when they talked about action figures, and when he'd said that baseball sounded fun, it made everyone shiver a little. He was large, a sneering boy, and they all decided to keep their distance from him as they said their goodbyes and pedaled away. But of course, Reggie lived on the block, so he inevitably found a place in their games. He was never invited, always just sort of invited himself. He made the teams uneven, and no one seemed to want him to play, but the boys were too polite to tell him to buzz off. That was how it started, but Josh and his friends had regretted giving in so easily almost at once. They'd been correct in their assumptions that he liked to hurt people. He had nearly broken Patrick's wrist when he fouled him during basketball. He had shoved Terry off his bike during a bike race, skinning both his hands and his knees. And every time he threw a football to you, you either caught it or you wound up with a bloody nose. By the end of the summer, their politeness had turned into fear, and they were all too afraid of him to tell him to go away when he came to invite himself to their games. They were playing baseball when it happened. Reggie had seen them setting up and inserted himself into the game, as he usually did. Terry sighed loudly, covering it up with a cough when Reggie got close enough to hear them. Josh and Terry had tried to explain that letting him play would make the teams uneven, but Reggie didn't really care. He made it pretty clear that he was going to play whether they liked it or not, and there wasn't really anything that could be done about it. Snarf had walked up then, snuffling Josh's hand for pats, and Josh had dropped to his knees to give him scratches. The dog accepted the attention, but his eyes never left Reggie, and Josh could see the mistrust in them. Reggie was the only person that Josh had ever seen elicit a growl from the usually good-natured dog. Reggie had quickly learned not to come into Josh's yard, as Snarf would not tolerate him. This was fine with Josh, because unlike the others, whose houses Reggie frequently visited, Snarf had kept him out of his yard and his fingers off of Josh's stuff. Josh was also careful to keep Snarf inside when he wasn't out there to supervise him. He had seen the way Reggie's piggy little eyes narrowed when he looked at the dog, and Josh knew enough to be cautious. He wished he'd just put Snarf inside when he started growling that day, but he had pushed it away and hoped it would help Reggie know that they wouldn't tolerate any funny business. The game had gone about as well as expected until the 5th inning. Reggie and Terry had been team captains, and Reggie had won the coin toss, so he got to pick first. Reggie and Walt had been on a team, and Terry and Josh had been on another, with Patrick acting as an umpire or standing in if someone got tired. Reggie had belted a few down the road, and he and Walt were winning 7-3. The trade-off for Reggie's freakish strength was that he wasn't particularly coordinated. He missed a few fly balls and let a few slide between his legs, so Josh and Terry weren't as far behind as they could have been. There had been some good-natured shoving, as good-natured as it ever got with Reggie, but there was no real violence to speak of. Snarf had gone to lounge on his lawn, and the boys were actually having fun, despite 4 of them having to keep an eye on the 5th. It all went south when Reggie took the plate again. He cracked it a good one, and Josh and Terry prepared to get out of the way as Reggie ran. Reggie did not believe in dropping the bat after hitting the ball, as the bruises on the boy's ankles could attest. The bat made a loud crack as it hit the ball, and as it sailed off down the street, Josh made a dash for it. Reggie came running around first base, Terry hovering between second and third as Patrick stood on the manhole that was serving as the pitcher's mound. Patrick had quickly figured out that a third might be required when the teams took the field, and had agreed to be the pitcher and the umpire. Walt was whistling as Reggie ran for second, and the ball bounced once before Josh grabbed it. He had turned to throw it when he heard Terry yell out in pain. Terry, Walt would later tell him, had tripped Reggie as he ran past, and the big boy had fallen and skinned his hands and knees. Reggie had come up mad, cracking him in the stomach with the bat, and towering over him as the fallen boy prepared to have his skull caved in. Josh dropped the ball, sprinting towards the pair, as Reggie lifted the bat up to hit Terry again. Walt ran from the sidelines as Patrick came shouting and telling Reggie to knock it off. All 3 of them knew they wouldn't make it before he hit Terry, and they were just hoping to get there before he hit him again. Fast as they were, though, Snarf was faster. Snarf hit Reggie in the back, sending him reeling forward and dropping him into the street a second time. He stood over Terry protectively, snarling and showing his teeth at Reggie's back. Reggie was getting back up, shaking his head, but Snarf didn't seem to want to attack him. He just stood over Terry, the boy still frozen in surprise and fear. Reggie got back on his feet, his knuckles turning white against the bat's handle as he squeezed. Josh saw him turn in slow motion, the boy still running for Terry, but it made no difference. Snarf was staring daggers at Reggie, but when Josh called his name, he looked towards him, tail wagging. The bat crashed down on the dog, and the pitiful noise he made sent a shard of glass through Josh's guts. Walt and Patrick arrived in time to grab Terry under the arms and drag him away from the scene. Josh hit Reggie as hard as he could around the waist, dropping him to the concrete a 3rd time and sending the bat clinking across the asphalt with an angry wooden clitter. Reggie hit his head on the concrete, and as the wind oofed out of him, Josh punched him in the face. He saw Reggie's eyes glaze a little with the impact, his lips quivering in surprise as his head bounced off the pavement again. Josh got off him, picking up the bat as Reggie tried to get his bearings. Josh pointed the bat at Reggie, yelling at him to get out of here. He told him not to come near him, his friends, or his dog again. He said some of the adult words he knew, the cusses sounding high and whispery as he fought back tears. Reggie got up on an elbow, grinning at Josh as he seemed to dare him to do anything. When the other 3 boys came up behind him, though, Reggie realized that he might be in trouble if he decided to act in haste. He could take 1 kid, bat or no bat, but 4 kids would probably beat the tar out of him. So, he backed up on his hands before breaking into a run and fleeing for home. Josh would never feel bad about what he had done to Reggie, but looking back at that moment, he would feel a lot of shame. The shame came from letting his anger blind him to Snarf's pain, from letting his need to dispel Reggie separate him from his dog when he needed him most. It didn't matter, though. None of it really mattered. When Josh turned back around, it was already too late. Josh found himself glaring at Reggie's old house as he watched a pair of Transformers walk off with their chocolate. The house was occupied now, but it had been empty for quite some time after the family had moved away. That had happened later, months after he'd killed Snarf, and those months felt like an eternity at the time. Reggie's parents had refused to believe that their son had killed Snarf, and they seemed angrier that Josh and his friends had beaten up their son. When they threatened to call the police, after Reggie had come home with scrapes and bruises, Josh's mom had just dropped the whole thing. Reggie's parents are threatening to sue us for hospital costs, and I can't afford something like that, sweetie. I'm sorry about Snarf, but if we call the cops, we'll be in trouble as well. She told Josh this, and he had seethed in his 10-year-old heart. He saw a big blonde kid with a crew cut, dressed in a karate gi, and he almost didn't hand him anything. Reggie was still on his mind, and this kid could have passed for him once upon a time. His eyes, they didn't really have that evil gleam in them, though, and Josh smiled at him as he handed him some candy. The kid threw him a mock salute and rejoined the throng still parading up the street. Reggie had been bigger, meaner, but in the end, Reggie had not been braver. Josh had been inconsolable after the death of Snarf. He had pretended to be sick for a week, and his mother had just let him pretend in the wake of his sorrow. His grandma stayed with him, often just sitting with Josh while he wallowed in his misery. She never pushed him as he moped around the house, just letting him feel his hurt as she waited for it to pass. He mostly just lay on the couch and watched TV, not really paying attention, just liking the noise. As they sat there one afternoon, her arm draped around him, she told Josh something he would never forget. "I know you miss your friend, but you can't let his death be the end of your life. You have to live it for both of you now. It's what he would have wanted." Josh looked up at her with big swimmy eyes. But I miss him." She smiled. "I know you do, but it's almost Halloween, a time when they say the ghosts of our loved ones can walk the earth again. Maybe, just maybe, his love will be great enough to bring him back to you." That made him think. If ghosts and spirits could walk the earth on Halloween, then maybe Snarf could too. Josh spent the rest of the month in a little better mood, waiting for Halloween night so he could see if Snarf would come and visit. His mom had to work on Halloween, but Grandma was home with him and said that she could take him out trick-or-treating if he wanted. Josh didn't want to go out, though. He sat in his room and watched out the window, hoping to see Snarf as he ran up the front walk. When his friends came to see him, they were all costumed and looking for him to join their group. They begged him to trick-or-treat with them. They hadn't seen him in months. He hadn't come out to play since the baseball game, and they missed him. Each of them was dressed as a different Power Ranger, and Terry said his grandma had sent him a second costume if Josh wanted to use it. Josh had a feeling that Terry had bought it in case he decided to come out with them, and though touched, Josh still didn't want to go. He might miss Snarf, and he wanted to see him if he came back. Once again, Grandma had the answer. "I'll keep an eye out for him, and I'll tell him to stay if he comes to see you while you're gone." Josh was hesitant, but after some coaxing, he put on the costume and left with his group of friends. They had made him the Blue Ranger, his favorite Power Ranger, and as they set out into the night, he felt a little better. Josh had missed his friends over the past few weeks, but after what had happened, he just couldn't bring himself to see them. Going out with him now made him feel a lot better, and they spent a few blissful hours filling their sacks with candy. It would have been a perfect Halloween if Reggie hadn't come. Josh started noticing lights going out in the cul-de-sac as it ticked closer to 10. The kids who were present were becoming older, the little kids already turning in, and he furrowed his brow as Snarf still hadn't appeared. He felt like he had on that first Halloween after Snarf's death, looking for him as he'd walked the streets, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. Josh heard a bark and snapped his head to the side expectantly. He frowned, though, when he saw it was just a lab in a bee costume. Its owner came hurrying after him, followed by a football player heading for the next house. A pair of ninjas wandered up next, and Josh sighed as he dug them out some candy. Surely he wouldn't stand him up. He hadn't stood him up that night, so why start now? It was almost 10 by the time the lights started going out on that long-ago Halloween. The street began to empty, and Josh's bag was beginning to get heavy. He and his friends had bulging sacks of candy, and they were sitting on the sidewalk and trading. Josh had started out looking for Snarf, glancing around as they walked against the tide of excited children. In those 2 hours, he had gotten a reprieve from his sadness, but as the night wound down, the old feelings were starting to fester again. He told his friends that he had to get home, and Josh started looking for him again as he moved through the thinning group of trick-or-treaters. He wanted to get home so he could see if Snarf had come back, which was probably why he missed Reggie. When the egg hit him in the side of the head, Josh staggered under the impact. His ear rang, and he thought he was bleeding when his gloved hand came away wet. One look told him it was just egg yolk, though. He looked across the street and saw Reggie grinning at him from under a lamppost. He wasn't in costume, dressed in his baseball shorts and a tank top, but he did have a silver bat in his hand, tossing an egg up and catching it in his other as he smiled. Josh froze when he saw that he was staring at him, realizing how vulnerable he was out here alone with his house 3 streetlights away. "Been waiting for you to come out. We got unfinished business, Four Eyes. I think I owe you the same sort of beating I gave your stupid dog," he chuckled, swinging the bat experimentally. Josh stepped off the curve towards him, angry at what he had said, but thought better of it immediately. That metal bat could cave his skull in, and Reggie was pretty good at swinging bats. He glanced towards his house instead. 3 streetlights didn't seem so far, and Josh thought he could probably run faster than Reggie if it came to it. It seemed it was either run or sit here and get killed by this psycho. The choice seemed pretty obvious. He made the first light, easily outstriping Reggie, but Josh heard him getting closer as he moved under the second light. Reggie slapped the light pole with the bat as he went by, and it made a hollow thunk sound as it connected. Josh started to panic when he heard it. What if he caught him? What if he killed him? Would he die in the street like Snarf had? Josh wished that Snarf was here as his tears streamed down his face. He would have protected him. Snarf would have stopped Reggie from hurting him. If Josh hadn't distracted him that day, maybe Snarf would be here to help him. His house was in sight when the second egg cracked him in the back of the head. He stumbled as the egg connected. Josh had forgotten about the eggs. Though it hadn't been thrown very hard, it surprised him. Josh staggered into the fence that separated his yard from the neighbor's and crashed against it with a loud thunk. His head connected with the boards as he fell, and his head swam a little as the cheap plastic mask broke into pieces. Josh was reaching out in slow motion, moving his hands and legs like someone wading through mud. He rolled onto his butt as he prepared to take off again, but it was too late. Reggie loomed over him, the streetlight gleaming off his bat. "Looks like I caught you, Four Eyes," Reggie said, raising the bat. "Say hi to your dog for me when you see him." Josh pushed up against the fence, hoping it would fall backwards, knowing it wasn't going anywhere. Reggie raised the bat high, the metal twinkling as the light made galaxies of starbursts. Josh closed his eyes, preparing for the blow that would end his life prematurely. When the growl split the night, though, he opened his eyes and looked between Reggie's splayed legs. Reggie had turned his head to look at the shadowy crevice between the house and the fence that now stopped Josh from escaping. Between the structures stood a snarling, red-eyed creature that seemed to fill the space with its shadowy mass. Reggie took a sidelong step away from Josh, the beast snarling hugely as it took a single thunderous step towards him. Josh felt his breath hitch as Reggie stepped into the street, and the looming thing lowered its head and rumbled. Josh's brain couldn't fathom it. This nightmare creature had appeared in his neighborhood out of nowhere, and was now seconds away from ending both him and his bully. When it loosed that single ear-splitting snarl, Josh put his head between his knees and pushed his palms against his ears. He sat in the darkness, screaming against his legs as he prepared to be devoured. Josh had assumed that he would die that night after running from the hulking brute, but never like this. When the warm tongue slid over his hair, he cracked the back of his head against the fence, trying to escape again. Then he opened his eyes, gasping like a trapped animal, to find Snarf's panting, grinning face. Reggie was gone, Bat lying in the street, and Josh wrapped his arms around his lost friend. He laughed as Snarf licked his cheek. He pressed his face against the dog's familiar short fur, and Josh's sadness melted away as Snarf's doggy tongue bombarded him. That was how his mom had found him, laughing with his back against the fence as her headlights dissipated the ghostly dog licking him as he'd done so many times before. Snarf had come back and visited him on Halloween night every year since. His mother didn't come right out and say it at first. She was upset about his injuries, but she told Josh later that she had seen Snarf for a few seconds before her headlights hit him. After he told her what had happened with Reggie, she called the police. She gave them the bat, told them how Reggie had been a problem this summer, and started a process of having a restraining order placed against him. She was tired of being bullied by Reggie's parents, as tired as Josh was of being bullied by Reggie. Reggie's family moved shortly before the order was finalized. Josh never saw him again, and was happier for it. Josh watched his mother walk up the front lawn now, Lily in her arms as she sleepily held onto her sack of candy. She was stumbling on the way back. "I think we're going to have some cocoa if you'd like to join us." "Give me a few more minutes, Mom. I think he's just running late this year." Mom smiled. "Take all the time you need, dear." She walked inside, leaving him on the stoop. The street was emptying, only a few stragglers heading for home, and Josh glanced around furtively. Where was Snarf? Had he forgotten about his old friend? 20 years was a long time to visit someone who wasn't a little boy anymore. Maybe he had... Josh dropped the bowl of candy when that ghostly cold nose prodded his hand. He looked down to find Snarf, tail wagging, as he smiled up at him from the front lawn of the house he had loved so much. Josh wrapped his arms around him, and it felt like coming home again. The smell of spent gasoline and day-old garbage assaulted Derek as he stepped out onto the street. He always waited till sunset to head to McLeod's. That was when the best prospects were out. Derek had wanted the alcohol almost an hour before sunset, but he knew that if he intended to go to bed with someone tonight, he needed to pace himself. A woman might accept a man's advances if she was drunk, but they would rarely spend time with a strange drunk while they were sober. This was a lesson that Derek had learned early on, and it was likely the only thing that had stopped him from being a full-blown alcoholic. His phone chirped, and Derek fished it out, wanting to see what cutie was texting him so early. He sighed when he recognized Charlene's number, though, asking if he would be at the bar tonight. Charlene, the one-night stand who wouldn't take a hint. He had slept with her about 5 months ago, and the sex hadn't been worth the constant dodge he had to run with her now. Despite his better judgment, he'd taken her out a few times since their hookup, but he never took her to bed again. Derek didn't do seconds, and he put the phone back in his pocket, knowing that he'd have to cut her off soon. Besides, he had other prospects these days. As he rounded the corner, Derek couldn't help but see the spotlights in front of the old warehouse that had once been a cannery. The man standing out front was doing his best to catch people's interest, but more of them were heading on without a second look. Derek could feel the urge to drink, almost as strong as the urge to bury someone who lived rent-free in his head in alcohol, but he stopped for a moment as he looked at the sign strung over the door of the warehouse. Derek scoffed as he read it. A truly frightening experience or your money back. What bullshit. The man looked like the titular carnival barker. His jacket was black, with red thread to accent the cuffs and collar, not to mention the garish gold buttons that glimmered from his dark cloak. He was tall, and he wore a large black hat with a handlebar mustache, and his grin made Derek think that he was not to be trusted. He stood before what looked to be a very old and decrepit warehouse, a place Derek had driven by 1,000 times and never looked at twice. Now it was hung with streamers and cast in the buttery light of 2 spotlights. The windows of the warehouse danced with murky half-light, like a fire slowly burning out, and the lack of screaming or giggling teenagers coming out of the front made Derek very wary. This time of year, an empty haunted house was always suspicious. Come one, come all, see your greatest fears realized, or your money back. Derek fixed the man with a disbelieving eye. That's so. Oh, yes, young man, but be warned. This haunted house is likely to be unlike anything you've ever experienced before. This house will show you things that you didn't know about yourself, and tap into what truly scares you. Derek scoffed, but he fished out a 20 and a crumpled 5 and laid it in the box. It's better be worth it. The barker smiled toothily as he slid the bills into the lockbox. I can assure you, sir, it will be well worth every penny. As Derek went inside, his phone chirped again. He stepped into the entryway and looked down, seeing a picture of an empty bar stool with a text that asked where he was. Charlene appeared to be waiting to ambush him at his favorite watering hole. He considered just going home and drinking the vodka he'd been ignoring in the fridge since he'd come from work, but decided that he wouldn't let her stop him from having a good time. Maybe tonight was the perfect opportunity to break it off with her and make it stick. Derek stepped into the cloud of smoke as a nearby fog machine belched its payload, and was suddenly surrounded by an active bar scene. It was pretty well done. It looked just like McLeod's on 11th, a favorite watering hole of his. This was where he often picked up the best trim, and it was the place he would likely find himself at later tonight. Derek didn't like to go to bed alone or sober. When he was alone and sober with his thoughts, he inevitably thought of her. He groaned as he walked up to the bar, wondering if this was one of those religious haunted houses by the Mothers Against Drunk Driving. It had all the earmarks, after all. Hazy bar, people milling about, shadowy corners where bad actors were just waiting to jump out and startle you. Derek couldn't believe he'd just given money to one of these religious nuts and their revival miracle tent. He supposed he couldn't be angry. The man had offered a full refund when he got out. Derek might as well see what there was to be seen and then get his $25 back. He approached the bar, not imagining they had any alcohol, but willing to play along. The man behind the counter was dressed in the usual attire that Thomas always wore. Thomas seemed to love dressing like the odd man out in a barbershop quartet. Suspenders, handlebar mustache, striped waistcoat, shiny black shoes, immaculately coiffed hair. As he approached the bar, however, he noticed something a little different. His face looked like someone had used an eraser to make it a flesh-colored smudge. He looked up at Derek, silent as the grave, as he stared eyelessly at him. Derek tried to order a gin and tonic, but the not Thomas just shrugged and went back to what he was doing, turning away from Derek as he got back to work. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Derek yelled, but as he tried to reach over the bar and grab the not Thomas by the sleeve, the man walked away and went to serve some of the other oddly smudged individuals at the end of the bar. They all had that weird thing going on with their face. Was this some kind of theme, maybe? Derek didn't understand. He sighed as he sat back down, waiting for the bartender to come back around again. The smudged Thomas clone was more like the real Thomas than he knew. He and Thomas had gotten into a fight 3 days ago, and Derek's reception at McLeod's had been icy ever since. It was Thomas's fault, really. If he wanted to bed Jeanette, then he should have made his move. Derek wanted her, Thomas wanted her, but Derek had struck out first, and now Jeanette was just another notch on his bedpost. The problem was that when Jeanette realized she had been nothing but an evening's distraction for Derek, she had switched to one of the other dive bars in town, and now Thomas blamed him for running her off. "Dunno what I expected or why I bother talking to you," Thomas had said. "It's like being mad at a dog for eating your sandwich. He's a hungry mutt that only knows he wants to eat." "Seems like the bartender might be a little upset with you." Derek jumped and glanced over at a familiar-looking brunette who had sat down beside him. She was dressed in a short black dress, her leggings artfully ripped, and her shiny black hair hanging in her face. When she smiled, he could see her teeth were slowly slipping into unevenness, but he found it charming somehow. The longer he looked at her, the more familiar she seemed, and less like anyone he had ever known. "You must have slept with some girl he liked." She was drinking something through a straw with a distinctly fruity smell, but the thickness and the color reminded him more of a bag of blood. As he watched it slide up the straw, he felt a little sick to his stomach. He could see her throat working as she drank, her eyes closing as she enjoyed it, and Derek was powerless to break her stare as much as he wanted to look away. As a trickle ran down the corner of her mouth, he finally found the strength to clear his throat and glance around the smoky bar. This was definitely the oddest haunted house he had ever been to, and he was beginning to doubt his previous suspicions of a religious experience. Do I know you?" he asked, scanning the bar to see if there was someone else he knew here. The girl was cute, but looking at her made him feel weird in a way he hadn't in a long time. She grinned as she drank, the soupy sound of her drink disappearing up the straw and making his skin crawl. It was like listening to someone drain a corpse with a bendy straw. "Not for long, though you think of me often enough. In a way, I'm the reason you do the things that you do. I'm never far from your mind, though you wish I wasn't. You can try to drink me away, Derek, but I'll never truly be gone." Derek laughed, but there was no mirth in it. He was thinking that the woman had captured his earlier thoughts perfectly. "Do you always talk in riddles to people you just met at a bar?" He turned back, but something was different about her. Had she been wearing glasses before? They didn't really fit the elegant dress she was wearing. They were the thick kind, the kind that librarians wear, the kind that are more function than form. She was still pretty, but the glasses looked like a prop on a well-dressed young woman rather than something that she needed. Only to people who can't understand plain speech. His phone buzzed, and Derek checked to see that Charlene had sent him another text. She wanted to know where he was and how he was, to let him know that she was thinking about him. She was so clingy. Why couldn't she just take the hint? Didn't she realize that he wasn't just being coy when he went home with other women? That he wasn't playing hard to get when he didn't return her calls or answer the door? She wanted to lock him down, but he couldn't stay with her. He'd start seeing that body as it lay in the casket, hear her words as she told him she was leaving, and the only thing that would make it go away would be another drink or another conquest. "I'd like to say you've grown into a fine man, but we all know it isn't true. You've changed very little since high school. I doubt you ever will." "Well, that's something to work with. Did we go to high school together then? Were you one of the little nerdlets that I never called back? Maybe some one-night stand I ghosted after I was done?" He squinted at her. Had she had the pimples when they first started? He had only looked away for a second, but she had just the slightest hint of acne across her cheeks, like a dusting of freckles. They weren't the livid pustules of a teen experiencing their first crop, but the last light kiss of puberty that an 18-year-old might experience before they simply dried up and were no more than a momentary problem after that. She smiled as she noticed him noticing them, and he thought again that her teeth seemed odd. Had she once had braces, maybe? "Oh no, we were never very intimate. I think you would have liked to be, but..." She paused long enough to take a sip of her drink, the liquid having returned by some unnoticed bartender. "You were so painfully shy around me. You could speak confidently to any cheerleader or popular girl in school, but you were utterly befuddled by me and my braces and my glasses." Derek was speechless. This girl couldn't be who she was claiming to be. Lisa was... I'm sorry," Derek said, glancing over and seeing someone he hoped he recognized. "I see someone else I know. I should really go say hi to them." He slid off the bar stool and took off on wobbly legs before almost spilling himself onto the ground. The young woman, younger now than she had been at the start, smiled at him as she showed off a mouthful of metal. "Take your time, Derek. I don't have anywhere to be. I'll be waiting for you. I'm always waiting for you," she said, throwing the last at Derek's back as he rushed off into the small crowd. He thought the woman's name was Cindy, or maybe Chelsea. He only recognized her from the back because that was the most memorable image he had of her in his head. Her blonde hair was still long and soft as it rolled down her back, and when he approached, she was talking with a small group of other hazy people. Their faces seemed scrunched, their features swirled in the same eraser marks that everyone else had, and when he touched her, she turned around slowly. "Thank God, Cindy. Did the guy on the sidewalk talk you into this little..." But he stopped when he saw her face. Her face was as smooth and featureless as the others, and she took one look at him and walked away into the crowd. "Cindy," he called, taking a step towards her before catching sight of a familiar brown ponytail as its owner leaned over the bar. Mary was a staple at McLeod's. She might have been a little too old for Derek, her status as a cougar established before Derek had even had his first drink, but she'd been sweet for an evening. He batted at the ponytail playfully, waiting for her to turn around so he could ask her what the hell was going on here. She had been a little icy to him since they slept together, but surely she would help him figure this out before he had a freaking breakdown. She turned around angrily when he batted her braid, and Derek saw that she was also smooth and featureless from eyebrows to chin. She huffed and took herself elsewhere, and as Derek watched, he became aware that most of the people in the bar were women who looked familiar. One-night stands, old girlfriends, sexual conquests of every flavor, all of them milling about like they couldn't see him, and even if they could, they couldn't care less. They pressed in as their numbers swelled, but Derek remembered them all. It was impressive and depressing how many women you could sleep within a 6-year period, and Derek found he was adrift in a sea of jaded barflies. They had their own tidal pull, and as Derek tried to push his way to the door, they seemed to pull him back towards the bar with each push he made to escape them. Then someone wrapped a hand around his and pulled him back to the bar stool, and he accepted it without protest. It was the not Lisa, and she looked a lot more familiar now. She wore the same ripped leggings and puffy sweater dress that she had worn the night of the party. The leggings were no longer just artfully ripped. Derek could see the glass shards and torn skin beneath them. The sweater was dotted with red splotches, and he might have thought she'd been shot if he hadn't known what had killed her. The left lens of her glasses was a spider web, pristine ice broken by a stray rock, and he remembered that. After all, they had buried her in those glasses, and he remembered it being the only imperfection as she lay there in her casket. It was the only real thing about her, after the coroner had done his work of making her beautiful again. "Why are you here?" Derek asked, watching the throng of women as they surged around the bar he was sitting on. It's not enough. that I live with your ghost every day. Now I have to see you here too? Oh gee, I'm sorry that I'm the stick that you jab yourself with on every occasion. Unfortunately for you, I'm your greatest fear. Not me, not really, but what I represent. You can't let yourself be close to anyone like you were with me. You can't open yourself up and embrace intimacy. In a way, I'm the manifestations of your issues with that intimacy. You bury your fears and woes in an endless stream of sex and are never satisfied. No matter how much you drink, how many women you go to bed with, you'll never lose my ghost. Not unless you let yourself forget me. His phone buzzed again, and he saw that Charlene had texted him. Her message was a little different this time. She told him she was sorry for bothering him so much, and how she'd stopped trying to insert herself in his life. She apologized for not being enough for him and hoped that he had a good night. Derek looked at the phone, feeling his stomach knot as he thought about how he had run off another one. She seems nice. Maybe you could give her a chance. I can't. What if I let her down like I let you down? What if I accidentally kill her too? Lisa smirked, and it did interesting things to her broken face. You blame yourself for my death, but did you really have anything to do with it? Derek scoffed. How had he not caused her death? He'd been too focused on drinking and partying to make sure that his girlfriend had gotten home safely. He had stood right there and let her leave with someone else, instead of taking her himself. Why do you think that's your fault? I would have left regardless. You no more caused my death than the tree we hit did. Let it go. Derek could see that night, the same night he always saw when it haunted his nightmares. He had been at Marty Jenner's party, the one he held every Christmas break, and Derek was drunker than he'd ever been. Lisa didn't drink. He had dragged her to this party mostly so he could show off his new girlfriend, and it was pretty clear to everyone but Derek that she was done with it. When he tried to kiss her, she had pulled away, telling him that his breath smelled like rotten fruit. He told her not to be such a prude, and she had told him that she was leaving. Kyle Warren, one of the guys on the football team with Derek, had been leaving too. He was less drunk than Derek, but that wasn't saying much. Derek had still been hungover the next day when his mother had come to give him the bad news. Kyle had wrapped his vehicle around a tree 3 blocks from his house, killing both of them instantly. Derek had never forgiven himself for that, and he'd stayed pickled for the rest of his life. Looking at Lisa now made him feel even worse. Forget about it. Forget about me. Stop torturing yourself. You had nothing to do with my death. Let yourself be happy, and let go, before it's too late. She swam before his eyes, and it was only then that Derek was aware he was crying. His phone chirped again, and he saw that Charlene was calling him this time. As he picked it up, he saw the women part, leaving him a clear path for the exit. Give her a chance. A real chance. Let yourself be happy for a change. Derek left, apologizing for being so distant, as he and Charlene made plans to meet up at McLeod's in about half an hour. So, said the barker, as Derek stepped onto the street, did you discover something truly terrifying? Derek nodded. Yeah, I think I might have also found something I'd lost, too. Derek dropped another 20 onto the box and walked away, as the barker smiled and watched him leave shakily. Another satisfied customer. Ready to go trick-or-treating, sweetie? Matthew was standing on the front porch, looking up at his mother through the eye holes of his homemade ghost costume. Mom, I don't feel good. Maybe I won't go out tonight. His mom looked down at him, smiling in that strange way he had become so accustomed to. It was definitely supposed to be his mom, her red hair falling softly around her shoulders as she wore the thrift store bridal gown that she had ripped up for her zombie bride costume. But Matthew knew that it wasn't her. When she turned her head, he could hear the tendons creaking in her neck, and her rictus of a smile made the corners of her mouth turn up painfully. Come on, honey. Halloween comes but once a year. Matthew sighed, if only that were the case. They stepped off the front porch, making their way into the throng of children that happily capered about the cul-de-sac. His ghost costume looked a little plain when compared to the others, but Matthew couldn't find it in himself to be self-conscious anymore. They weren't kids, at any rate. Not the kids he'd grown up with. Behind their colorful masks or painted faces, their oddly yellow eyelids were black with soulless eyes. "I can't," Matthew said, letting his hand slip from his mother's. "Can't what, sweetie?" she asked, turning her painful smile on him. "I can't do this anymore," he yelled, throwing his bucket down and rounding on her. The throng of trick-or-treaters turned to stare at him, and Matthew suddenly realized his mistake. Not for the first time, and not for the last. "Sweetie," his mother said, turning slowly, her arms and legs like something full of coat hangers and newspaper. "It's Halloween. You either treat, or you get tricked." The kids began to circle around him, their voices low, their eyes shining like pools of tar. "Trick or treat, trick or treat, trick or treat, trick or treat." Matthew could hear his heart beating in his ears. He could almost hear it as he backed away. It was noisy, soupy, and constantly pounding, fundamentally different from a normal heartbeat in every way. He bumped into a teenage Michael Myers, and the big mute pushed him over before he could properly get his bearings. He fell down hard on his chest, and then they were on him. Luckily, as Matt lay face down on the concrete, he didn't have to watch this time. They ripped his back apart, their sharp little teeth digging into his flesh. He felt the warm blood oozing down his back, the asphalt drinking it up as the kids tore him apart. His arms separated with a sickening pop, his sheet tearing as it was ripped, and Matthew lost consciousness. He hoped that maybe this would be the last time, and that it all would end. He was so tired of being a ghost, tired of Halloween, and as the bright lights made him squint, he felt hot tears joining his blood on the pavement. "Ready to go trick-or-treating, sweetie?" Matthew looked up at his mother, nodding as he reached up and took her hand for the 1,000th time. It didn't feel like a real hand, not anymore. It felt mushy in the wrong places, hard and unmoving in others, like a palsied claw after a loved one's had a stroke. She looked down at him, smiling like a corpse, and Matthew tried to ignore the fact that the skin around her ears was darker than it had been the last time. His mother appeared to be rotting before his eyes, but to make note of it would bring on something worse. He walked once more into the sea of children, watching them run and cheer, but feeling their eyes as they tracked him. The whole street was like living in a forest of lions. Any minute, they might spring from concealment and tear you to pieces. He had been here long enough to know, however, that as long as you played along with this everlasting Halloween, it was content to keep you in its clutches. As they came to the first house, Matthew could see old Mr. Debro as he smiled and stepped through the door. The liver spots on his head were starting to look more like mold, but Matthew tried to ignore it as he shook his bag half-heartedly. The old man would drop 2 small Kit Kats in there and tell him to have a great evening, just like he did every time. And Matthew just wanted to get on with the charade. When the candy didn't fall into the bag like it always did, Matt looked up and saw the grinning face of the old man as it loomed over him. "Forgot your manners, son?" Matthew gasped. He'd become so complacent. He'd been here long enough to know that you didn't get candy unless you said the magic words, but he was so tired. He'd been trick-or-treating for ages, and he was exhausted. Every time he finished, every time he came to the end, good or bad, it would all just begin again. He was starting to feel like if he looked at his own reflection, he might be the one that was beginning to rot. He tried to stammer out a hurried trick-or-treat, but he could already see the long, sharp legs as they protruded from the corners of the man's mouth. Whatever horrors that lay inside these things, already dragging itself free. The words came from what sounded like a drowned man's throat, or the dying voice of someone who's slowly choking to death. And Matthew heard it just as the pinchers on the horrific whatever it were shot out from between Mr. Debro's stained false teeth and latched onto his head. The teeth clicked together as they hit the ground like a set of sad castanets, but Matthew heard his words as he faded once more into black. "You'll have to remember next time." "Ready to go trick-or-treating, sweetie?" Matt didn't even look up at her this time. He lifted his hand and grabbed a hold of her withered paw as he let her lead him into the cul-de-sac. He moved on autopilot, remembering only the words that must be said as they came to each house. The candy filled the bag, the grown-ups continuing to smile their hollow grins, and all the while, Matthew trudged onward. He saw the corner coming up, the junction of Marla and Casterly, and Matt saw someone that made him go cold inside. The man was dressed as Indiana Jones, bullwhip hanging jauntily off his waist, and when he turned to wave at someone who had called his name, Matthew steered his mother towards a different house, back the way they had come. "Come on, Mom, we missed the Jafford house. Miss Jafford wants to see your costume, remember?" His mother looked unsure, but she turned away, smiling as she allowed herself to be led. "All right, Matty, don't tug." Matt looked back as he left, seeing the man and knowing that he didn't want his mother to talk to him. She had talked to him once before, hadn't she? She had talked to him, and something bad had happened, but it didn't seem like something that had happened here. He didn't know, he couldn't really say, but when he saw the guy, the ear-shattering heartbeat had come on again, and he suddenly knew that letting her talk to him would be the scariest thing he had ever experienced. As the night went on, Matthew held out hope that the lights might start going off, and that he might be allowed to sleep. The bag was heavy, the pillowcase bulging oddly as it threatened to split, but still, he and his mother walked the streets of the cul-de-sac. How many times had he done this, Matt wondered? 100? 200? 1,000? It felt like an eternity as his sore feet slapped the pavement, and his trainers threatened to fall to pieces. "Do you remember the first time, Mom?" he asked suddenly, his eyes heavy as he repositioned the bag to rub at them. "Your first Halloween?" she asked, looking down at him with that fishhook grin. "I sure do. You were so cute in your cow costume. You said ooh instead of moo, and the neighbors laughed and said you were adorable." "No," Matt said. "I mean the first time we did this." "Look over there," she said suddenly. "The Holsteins are waving. Let's go see what they have." Matt nodded, following behind her as she led him like a cow to the slaughter. Matthew remembered the first time. He remembered it well. He'd looked up into his mother's eyes and been so excited. He had run down the street, tugging her along as they went house to house to house. That had been the first time he'd seen the man on the corner, the first time he had steered her away from him, not understanding why. He had laughed when the pillowcase had ripped open, spilling his candy in the road, and when his mother had pulled another one out of nowhere, he had started filling that one too. The moon had been full, a big old round Halloween moon, and Matthew reveled in the light of the buttery orb. It had taken him a while to get tired, but he had finally asked Mom if they could go home so he could rest. She had tried to dissuade him, telling him they only had a few more houses, a little while longer. When he asked again, she had tried to push him on, but he had stopped. "I'm tired, Mama. I'm ready to go home." She had turned then, and that was the first time he had noticed the smile. Her smile, that sharp and painful grin that seemed sad as she looked at him, and he had known that there was something off. This wasn't what he had wanted. This hadn't been what he'd wanted. He had just wanted a Halloween that would... Matt swallowed, true fear creeping up in him as he looked at her unnatural smile and noticed that the children had stopped moving around them. He had just wanted a Halloween that would last forever. "Oh, sweetie," his mother had said, "you either get treats or you get tricks." That was when he had seen them for what they truly were. They had circled around him, chanting, "Trick or treat," and as they swarmed in, they had torn him to pieces with their bare hands. All the joy had melted off his face as their nails and teeth dug into him, and when he had woken up on the front porch, his mother asking if he was ready, he had known that something was amiss. "Matty?" Matthew looked up, seeing that Mrs. Holstein had asked him a question. "Sorry, ma'am, what were you saying?" "I asked if you were a scary ghost or not." She was smiling, but it was like Matt could see the bugs crawling under her skin. It made him think that each of them had some kind of centipede or spider beneath their skin, just waiting to leap out. All of them seemed to have something in them, just below the surface, and Matthew was no longer certain he wanted to know what it was. It was hungry, whatever it was, and it seemed to enjoy making him suffer for his slip-ups. "Yes, ma'am. He yawned, feeling wobbly as the candy sack tried to anchor him to the earth. "A scary go." He fell then, not for the first time either. He hit the ground, his mother asking him to get back up, but he was just so tired. Matthew closed his eyes, hoping he would pass out, but it never happened. He could feel the adults looming around him, hear the chants of "trick or treat," and when something slammed against his chest, he felt the breath whoosh out of him as it pierced his heart. He hoped it would be over this time, hoped he'd be allowed to die or wake up or whatever this was, but as he heard his mother's voice, he knew it wouldn't happen. "Ready to go trick-or-treating, sweetie?" His tired eyes came open, but as he reached for her hand, a new thought occurred. "I forgot something inside. I'll be right back." He took a step for the door, but her hand clutched at him, just as it had the last time he'd tried this. "It'll be okay. We can get it later. Come on, let's..." But then he shoved her, and that seemed to take her by surprise. He ran inside, shutting the door as she got back to her feet. As he turned the deadbolt, she started pounding dully on the hardwood. "Now, Maddie, you know how this works. You either get the treat, or you get the tricks." He could already hear the muffled cries of "trick or treat" coming from behind the door, and he backed away slowly as he watched it. He wasn't strong enough to push the couch in front of the door, or even one of the recliners, but he did shove the end table in the hallway over, as he went running up the stairs to close the door to his room behind him. He locked the door and squeezed himself into the corner as he threw the sheet he was still wearing across the room. He could hear a loud thumping coming from downstairs, and he didn't think that door would keep them out for long. He racked his brain, trying to figure out how to get out of this. He thought back across all those trick-or-treating trips, all the nights that had come before this, and his mind always went back to the man in the wide-brimmed hat. He was scared of him in a way that he wasn't of any of the others. Not the bugs or the feral kids or anything he'd seen scared him as much as that man. Why, though? Why did he terrify him so much? Why did he fill him with dread like this? "I want you to meet someone." He covered his ears, but the voice wasn't coming from the house. "He's kind of important to me, just like you." He put his head between his knees and started crying as the door broke loudly from downstairs, and the words of the children came wafting up to him. "I've been seeing him sometimes, after work or while you're at Grandma's for the weekend, and I think he might be..." But the rest of it droned down to a low growl as his brain hit the brakes on it. He tried desperately to remember what his mother had said, but he couldn't. His mind struggled with the memory, but as he tried to make it make sense, he heard them pounding on the bedroom door. They were pushing, threatening to break the door, and he curled into a ball as he tried to make the memories come back. "Trick or treat, trick or treat, trick or treat, trick or treat!" They came thundering into the room, and as they fell on him, one thought broke the surface above all the others. He needed to face his fears and go see that man. One clear word stuck out in his brain, though, as he was pummeled into oblivion. No. "Ready to go trick-or-treating, sweetie?" The words still sounded in his brain, even after the last few times. Matthew had gone along with her for the last however many times, to varying degrees of success. He always avoided the man, always turned her back into the endless cul-de-sac of candy-laden houses, but it always ended the same. He forgot his manners, he went off script and tried to escape. He simply fell over out of exhaustion, and then they had him. He reached for her hand again, and as they walked, his brain tried to argue itself into sense, just like it had the last however many times. They needed to talk to the man at the end of the block. No. "Trick or treat," Matt droned, Mr. Deborah smiling as the legs sat just inside his cheeks, a silent warning to be careful. "He knows something. Maybe it's how we get out of this." "No." Come on, Mom. Let's go to the Andersons," Matt said, stalling for time. "They're not going anywhere, honey," she said as he pulled her along, her lips looking chapped as she smiled and smiled. "He has to know something. We need to..." "No." "Are you a scary ghost?" Miss Holstein asked, and Matt nodded as he told her he was, indeed,
A scary ghost.
But if we just... No! Matt finally yelled, clutching his head as he fell to his knees in the road. He wanted his brain to shut up. He was tired. He was so tired. He wanted to go to bed. He just wanted this all to end. He just... That's when he noticed that they were looking at him. Matt closed his eyes, and oblivion came on not too much later. Well, not oblivion. Something more like purgatory. Ready to? But he shoved her again and went running down the street, ghost costume flapping as he jumped off the porch. The kids were after him in a second, but Matt didn't care. They would get him, one way or another, but he just needed a break from the constant tricking and treating. He was running up the street, the crowd behind him, and when he looked up, the children seemed to bulge with the scrabbling things as well. They were full of bugs, full of hate, and Matthew needed a way to get beyond this. He turned back just in time to bump into someone, and as he fell down, he covered his head, expecting to be killed by the howling mob. When it didn't come, Matt looked up to see who he had run into. Need a hand up, little buddy? It was the man in the Indiana Jones costume, and to Matt, he looked like the closest thing to an angel he'd ever seen. Matt took his hand, shaking a little as he looked behind him. The mob had stopped, watching the man in confusion, and as Matthew looked up through the eyes of his ghost costume, he became aware that this fellow looked different. He looked real, untouched by this place, and Matt wondered why he'd been afraid of him. "It's great to finally meet you, Matt. Your mother's told me all about you, and I've been looking forward to meeting you. I'm Derek. I guess I'm your mom's..." But the words seemed to slow down, and the dread came back into Matthew. As the mob came back to screaming life, Matt realized why he had been afraid of this guy. Matthew turned, wanting to run away, but he was blinded by bright lights and put his hands up to stop them. As he fell into oblivion, Matthew came to terms with what he had to do, and he hoped that he still had the strength. He needed to face his fears, otherwise he'd be stuck here forever. "Ready to go trick-or-treating, sweetie?" He looked up into his mother's smiling face, the corners of her mouth red as they threatened to crack, and shook his head. "Not yet, Mom. We're missing someone." He reached up and took her hand, and as they walked off towards the thing he feared most, the kids parted for them. They watched him, chanting their infernal mantra, and it seemed that he had the eyes of the entire neighborhood. As he walked towards the swollen moon, he felt it swivel in the sky, and the craters too seemed to watch him as he made a beeline for the spot he had tried to avoid. It wasn't easy. Each step felt like the first step towards a high dive at the pool, or the roller coaster at the amusement park. He could see the man, his hat at a jaunty angle, and as they moved closer to him, all the people around them held their breath. "Julia," Derek said, raising his hand and walking over. "And this must be Matthew. Good to meet you, buddy. I'm Derek." He put out a hand, and Matt shook it heartily. "Matty, I want you to meet someone," his mother said. "He's kind of important, like you, and I've been seeing him sometimes, after work or while you're at Grandma's for the weekend. I think he might be someone you'll be seeing a lot more of in the future. Matthew, this is Derek. He's my boyfriend." Matt told him it was a pleasure to meet him, and he watched the two of them talking quietly, expecting that now things would go back to the way they were. This was it. This was one of those storybook moments that would turn everything back the way it was supposed to be. Matthew smiled as he watched her slip his hand into his, and it felt like everything would be okay now. When the first person began to scream, he felt a little less sure than he had been before. The mob of children had followed them, the adults standing out like sore thumbs amongst them, and many of them were pointing at him. The huge moon that he had thought of as an eye only moments before cracked like an egg as it burst into two pieces. It began to rain something down on them, something that didn't look entirely pleasant. They slapped against his ghost costume wetly, but as one fell across the eye hole, Matt saw that they were bugs. They looked like a cross between a centipede and a spider, and as he threw it away, the crowd began to surge towards him. Matt ran, the only thing he could do, and as his mother and Derek stood amongst the throng of chasers, they looked like rocks in a rushing river. He ran, his sore feet almost spilling him into the road more than once. He'd been so sure that this would work, that this would free him, but now he wasn't sure what he was supposed to do. The creepy crawlies were biting him as they covered the outside of his costume, weighing him down and making him sore. As the mob closed in, their cries of "trick or treat" sounded like a war chant, and Matt saw bright lights coming up fast. He put a hand up, shielding his eyes, but he didn't dare stop running. As the lights bore down on him, he hoped he would wake up anywhere besides the front porch of his house. Heaven, hell, nothingness, whatever was coming next, Matthew welcomed it with open arms. The cries of the mob were driven into blissful silence, only to be replaced by a harsh and rhythmic beeping. Matt opened his eyes as his hand shot up to slap at his ear, making his head ring. He could see a pristine hospital room with a beeping IV pole attached to one arm, and the warm sun of mid-morning outside the big window. His mother was snoring softly as she lay across his feet, and as he moved his prickly legs to make them wake up, she stirred and looked at him in surprise. "Oh my God, Matthew!" She wrapped him in a hug, his IV making him feel pinched, but he was happy to have woken up somewhere different for a change. "Hey, Mom, what's going on?" She smoothed his hair, her eyes wet-looking as she tried to commit him to memory. You got hit by a car, sweetie. You ran away while we were trick-or-treating after..." She opened her mouth like a fish, but shook it off. It's not important. What's important is that you're awake." "Where's Derek?" The vision of the two of them standing stationary as the group of screaming children poured past them, still very vivid in his mind. He's been by a few times. He wanted to make sure you were okay. I told him I might need to take a break, though. I didn't mean to upset you when I told you. I knew it was sudden, but I shouldn't have said it so quickly. I should have eased you into it. I'm sorry, Maddie," she said, half crying. It's okay. I was just surprised. I shouldn't have run away. You should call him and let him know that everything's okay." His mother looked shocked, but happy. She'd clearly been worried for a while, but she was happy that Matthew was awake again. She stood up, asking if he wanted something to drink, and Matt nodded in the affirmative. His throat was very dry, and it felt like a while since he had used it properly. It wasn't until the sun set that night that Matthew became anxious again. His mother excused herself, saying she needed to get some food and maybe call Derek and tell him that Matthew was okay. She had sat with him all day, watching cartoons and just kind of holding him, but it appeared that her lack of lunch was catching up with her. The hospital was quieter now, the night shift still in full swing, but she still stopped before heading out the door. "You'll be okay for a few minutes, right? You look a little pale, like there's something on your mind." Matt assured her that he'd be fine, but he was still a little happier once she was out the door. As another yawn shot through him, Matthew thought about how his body would make him sleep soon, and he thought of something he should have considered earlier today. He hadn't noticed right away, but when he had brought his hand down from his ear, he had wiped something onto the sheet. He must have rolled it up in the sheet somehow, because he hadn't thought about it until he had put his hand onto the spot a while later. His mother had been in the bathroom, the door open so she could peek out at him to make sure he hadn't just disappeared, and when he unbound the sheet, he saw something far too familiar there, staining the sheet brown and red as it pressed against him. It was part of the things that had been falling out of the moon, the head and pincers of that strange centipede spider thing. He had picked it up in a napkin and thrown it in the garbage before his mother could see it. But what did it mean? Did it mean all that had been real? Had the creature come from inside his head? Matt didn't know what to think, but he found himself wondering something as he lay there, feeling tired. When he went to sleep, would he wake up in the real world, or would he fall back into that eternal Halloween? Matt was afraid that he might find out soon enough.